Upon hearing the bishop's instructions, Leonard was first taken aback before he inwardly sighed. Mr. Fool's prophecy was really accurate. No, it's not a prophecy. He was already aware of everything. Leonard quickly reined in his thoughts and followed the procedures to get Bishop St. Anthony to give him an official document. Then, he returned underground and brought 2 members into Cheney's Gate. After waiting for the keepers to check the documents, he came to Emlyn White's room, which was illuminated with shining silver candles that were covered with engraved patterns. He opened the heavy stone door with a brass key. Ghostly blue light entered the cell, stabbing Emlyn White's eyes to the point of him instinctively closing his eyes. His face was much paler than before, and his body was much thinner. He exuded a feeling that a gust of wind would lift him up at any moment. Thinking of Mr. Fool's answer, Emlyn suddenly felt confident in his current situation. Without opening his eyes, he slowly stood up and chuckled. "I knew you would take the initiative to send me out. Would you be disappointed if I said that it was just a routine investigation?" Leonard lampooned inwardly and replied without any expression, "I'll give you 30 seconds. If you don't leave Cheney's Gate within this period, I'll take it as you voluntarily choosing to stay behind." As a slightly more senior Nighthawk and a captain of a Red Gloves team for several months, Leonard had rich experience in dealing with prisoners. Emlyn's expression froze. He opened his mouth, wanting to say something, but he ultimately maintained his silence. He walked past Leonard and his 2 teammates and walked out of Cheney's Gate. Outside, he suddenly shuddered, as if he wanted to purge the chill in his body. "Once you return, getting some sunlight would fix you up. Oh, the sun is a rare commodity in Backland's winter, and you vampires don't enjoy sunbathing. Aren't you an apothecary? You can concoct some medicine from the sun domain yourself." Seeing this, Leonard casually reminded him. Emlyn's condition wasn't the best. On the one hand, he hadn't drunk any spirituality containing human blood for days. He could only rely on the blood of animals as a substitute. On the other hand, it was because he had stayed behind Cheney's Gate for too long. The power of Evernight that supported the seal had eaten into him a little, making him require the effects of medicine from the sun domain to remove the residual effects. As a potions professor, Emlyn was aware of his physical and mental condition. He didn't retort or nod. He only emphasized the word sanguine before asking, "Where's Father Utreski? Visit website ourlistnovel.com. He still needs to stay a little while longer. I hope this bloody war will end soon. Don't worry, we'll let him come out twice a week to get some sunlight. As for which days they'll be, it'll depend on the weather in Backland." Leonard gave a simple response before sending Emlyn White to the ground and onto the streets. Emlyn hesitated for a moment before asking again, "Where's the nearest hospital?" "What do you want to do?" Leonard asked in a professional manner. "Get a blood transfusion." Emlyn raised his chin slightly, trying his best not to change his expression. Blood transfusion, more like drinking blood. Leonard didn't call him out. He pointed in one direction and gave him the address. After watching the sanguine Viscount leave, he returned underground and began to discuss a recent case with his team members. After several days of traveling, Klein finally arrived near the Noise City ruins in the north. This was equally a desolate plain. The dried riverbed left traces of itself on the ground. Looking at the dark, shadowy city that was filled with a thin fog, he was in no hurry to get close. Instead, he found a hidden spot and muttered the honorific name of Mr. Fool. Following that, he took 4 steps counterclockwise and recited the incantation before entering the world above the grey fog. To return to Sephira Castle with just a thought, he needed the prayers of the Tarot Club members to stack together, forming a strong and firm anchor. That way, it would provide the Fool with the sufficient summoning power. With the help of the prayer light, Klein used his true vision to check the situation of the Noise ruins from afar. He discovered that the thin fog was slowly dissipating, but it couldn't completely dissipate. On the surface of the city, there wasn't a single spirit body thread. The people who were dressed in linen robes or animal hides were lying in different spots on the streets. They weren't as lively and busy as the time the City of Silver's expedition team visited. After the angel or sealed artifact that occupied this city discovered that their whereabouts were exposed, they chose to migrate. As Klein made a guess based on the situation in front of him, he retracted his gaze and looked at the grayish-white fog that held up Sephira Castle. He was trying to prevent the miracle invoker, or attendant of mysteries, or the corresponding sealed artifact from hiding in the historical void and ambushing the beyonders of the ancient Noise City. He didn't wish to directly encounter a cluster of translucent maggots that twisted into a huge vortex when he leaped into the fog of history, nor did he wish to be pursued by those terrifying tentacles. The ambush that Zaratul had laid for him still left Klein feeling a lingering sense of fear. From time to time, he would have nightmares, hoping to seek Miss Justice for another round of treatment for psychological trauma. This stimulus was worse than seeing his marionette, Enony, wear a monocle in front of him while his body remained completely immobile. This was because he had implicated the hounds of Fulgrim. After confirming that the historical void was safe, Klein returned to the real world. He stretched out his hand, grabbed, and pulled out his former self. This former self was also wearing a silk half-top hat, a black trench coat, and holding a simple glass lantern. In the next second, he jumped into the grayish-white fog and followed the illuminated spots in the historical void, running all the way to a period before the First Epoch, in that city of a long-dead civilization. To him, this was a very ingenious, safe house. This was because, aside from him, no scholar of yore could trace back to this lost piece of history. Of course, to him, coming all the way here had required him to expend a lot of his spirituality. He could only stay there for another 15 minutes at most, and that was only if he didn't make any burdening attempts at summoning historical void projections. After hiding his true body, Klein's projection in the real world moved forward, quickly arriving outside the noise ruins. He didn't blindly approach or enter. After circling to a small mound opposite the dried riverbed, he raised his right hand and summoned his original marionette, the cold Earl of the Fallen Connors Kilgore with dark blue eyes. Connors's body squirmed and instantly transformed into Gehrman Sparrow. Then, he reached out and took out a lantern from the historical void. The historical projection who summoned a historical projection had disordered the distance under the dim yellow light of the lantern. In a few steps, he arrived outside Noise City, alone. With the lantern in hand, he passed through the rotting buildings and passed through the thin fog before entering the ruins. Compared to using his true vision above the gray fog, actual contact made him discover more details. The humans and monsters lying in different spots had signs of decay, as though they had been abandoned for some time. Some of them sat on chairs under the eaves of the house, others slumped beside stoves. Some held moldy bread while others held hands. There were some leaning against the walls and sitting on the ground, their lips pressed against a bone flute. This allowed Klein to imagine the situation in the city back when they were living. Some of them were slacking off and resting. Some were baking food, and others were shopping along the streets. Others were focused on music as some came and went, laughing non-stop. There were also others fighting monsters in an arena. This was such a lively and bustling scene, but in reality, everyone had already died and were no longer in possession of their souls. They were only repeating predetermined actions. And one day, this strange scene froze with time, and everyone collapsed without any warning. A city formed by marionettes, the most realistic theater. Back then, the foggy town was in a similar situation. Although I'm also a seer, I still have to say that, in terms of horror, terror, and bizarreness, our pathway is definitely ranked amongst the top 3. Could it be that I'll be acting in the same manner in the future? Attendant of Mysteries. With the lantern in hand, Klein walked through the streets that were littered with corpses. He followed his spiritual intuition and headed for the ancient Noise City center. The situation here made him believe that the person who had once ruled the Noise ruins definitely had enough intelligence. After the City of Silver's expedition team broke the peace and serenity here, the entity didn't choose to kill or destroy any clues. Instead, this place was abandoned without hesitation before the entity migrated elsewhere. The reason why the City of Silver wasn't silenced probably had to do with an Amon parasite following behind. Yes, it could also be because of the true creator. As he casually let his thoughts wander, Klein quickly arrived at a relatively intact cathedral. Inside the cathedral stood a statue of a demonic wolf with 8 legs. It was covered with short and dark hair. There was a tuft of grayish-white fur at the top of the statue head. Its pitch-black pupils covered at least 3/4 of its eyes. It's not Flegrea, the dark demonic wolf that occasionally appeared in the Third Epoch, the god of wishes. He has been in the forsaken land of the gods for thousands of years and has finally found that sequence 1 beyond a characteristic. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Klein suddenly heard footsteps coming, resounding one after another. Standing sideways, he immediately cast his gaze outside the cathedral. He saw a figure slowly walking through the thin fog before its outline quickly formed. He was nearly 2.3 meters tall, with a slight hunch to his back. With grizzled hair, wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, and a scar at the corners of his mouth, he looked like an old priest or bishop while donning a long black clergyman's robe. His dark brown eyes were calm, unlike the monsters deep in the darkness who were bloodthirsty and zero intelligence. However, in the long, quiet night of low-frequency lightning, this clergyman didn't carry any animal hide lanterns or have any fire lit. He just quietly walked through the thin fog. Report chapter. Although it had been less than a week since he entered the forsaken land of the gods, Klein had long gotten a good understanding of the place through Little Sun. He knew that normal humans, even saints, had to use fire to create light in the darkness. Otherwise, it was very easy for them to encounter dangerous monsters lurking in the depths of the darkness, or be secretly devoured, disappearing without a trace, never to be found again. And at that moment, the elderly clergyman wasn't carrying any animal hide lanterns. Instead, he passed through the fog in the darkness and slowly entered the cathedral that was illuminated by the dim yellow light. If it wasn't for his deep and calm eyes that didn't show any signs of madness, Klein's first reaction would have been that he had encountered a special monster. Of course, having a normal person's state of mind and being immersed in darkness were contradictory traits. Any living creature with any semblance of normal intelligence could easily come up with a conclusion that this person might be even more terrifying than special monsters. Klein had only met one person who could pass through the darkness without being affected by it while having sufficient intelligence, blasphemer Amen. Sensing that the faint yellow light was reflected on his face, the tall black-robed clergyman with a slight hunch to his back stopped in his tracks. Looking at the demonic wolf statue, he hoarsely asked, "Where did the owner of this city go?" Klein was the kind of person who would try his best to resolve a problem peacefully if a fight with a stranger could be avoided. As he raised his guard, he calmly replied, "I don't know where either. I just entered the city, who knows where the owner went?" Just as he said that, the entire cathedral dimmed. A thin fog surged in like a tidal wave from the outside, drowning the interior. The lantern in Klein's hand failed miserably at illuminating the windows and the situation at the door. It was dark outside, and nothing could be seen. In the blink of an eye, the cathedral that worshipped the demonic wolf statue seemed to be isolated from Noise City. It was unknown where it was located. Klein's pupils dilated slightly as he looked at the clergyman with wrinkles and white hair. He asked in a deep voice, "Who are you?" The hunched clergyman replied in a condescending manner, "I'm an attendant by the Lord's side. I'm the angel of the holy word, Steph. I walk this land of the past that the Lord had passed on, doing so on his behalf in search of the blasphemer, hidden in the darkness." As he spoke, the elder's figure expanded to a height of 4 meters tall. Behind him, black illusory feathers appeared. Their shadows intersected and formed 4 pairs of gloomy but holy wings. Angel of the holy word, Steph. An attendant by the Lord's side. Land of the past. This is the blessed of the true Creator, the angel of fate's subordinate, a member of the Rose Redemption. It's no wonder that he can walk in the darkness. He has the power of degeneration protecting him. That evil god is still searching for the beyond, a characteristic of the attendant of mysteries. Klein had no choice but to raise his head and lock eyes with this clergyman who, despite wearing a black robe, had 4 pairs of angel wings on his back. This high-level existence angel's form remained wrinkled with grizzled hair. There was a sense of contradiction in everything about him. Pretending that he had never made an enemy of the Aurora Order, he calmly said, "That blasphemer has long fled. I'm also searching for him." After staring at Klein for 2 seconds, the angel of the holy word asked in a low voice, "Who are you?" It won't be convenient saying it out directly. Klein sighed and smiled. "I'm a lonely traveler." After he gave this reply, he suddenly felt an extreme sense of darkness developing within him. It then sank down and merged with the shadow created by the lantern. The pitch-black figure abruptly warped and came to life, stretching itself out to become another Gehrman sparrow, one with sinister and ferocious eyes and a solitary demeanor. This, Klein's pupils constricted. Without any hesitation, he reached out his right hand and grabbed outward at thin air. At this point, if he hadn't guessed that Steph was using his answer, he should have joined the Aurora Order and made the true Creator his god. At this moment, he already knew what it meant by angel of the holy word. This was clearly the angel of the evil word. By using a person's reply, he could extract a portion of the ambiguity or expand on it to create the effect of spirit language. When Klein said that he didn't know where the owner of the city had gone, Steph extracted the words, "I don't know where I went," trapping himself and isolating himself from the outside world. When this angel revealed his identity, every word was enhancing his level and strength. When Klein answered who he was, it ended up separating a lonely traveler from him. From the moment he appeared in Noise City, there was a strong sense of malice in the black-robed Steph. And just as Klein was attempting to summon a particular image from the historical void, the sinister Gehrman Sparrow seemed to share the same thoughts as he did. He too grabbed at the same projection, cancelling each other out. Seeing that his powers as a scholar of yore had been restrained, Klein's eyes narrowed. Without any hesitation, he opened his mouth and said a word in Jotun. But in the next second, the word was stolen. Standing at about 4 meters tall, the stooped angel of the holy word, Steph, had at some point in time grown a head covered in blood on his left shoulder. It looked very similar to him, but was much younger, a person who was approximately in the 40s. Around the head were 2 skinless arms that had mangled flesh. They had grazed different souls and had used beyonder powers that could steal thoughts. At the same time, another bloody head grew on Steph's right shoulder, one that looked to be in his 20s. Amongst the 3 heads, one grazed souls and stole Klein's thoughts, while the other was staring coldly at the target, deepening the self-awareness of the lonely traveler. The last one opened his mouth and said, "You lie. You are the person who destroyed the Son of God's descent ritual and interfered with the Lord's descent twice. You are one of the targets I'm looking for." The corners of Klein's mouth twitched as he calmly said a word in Jotun, Leodero. This was the true name of the Lord of Storms. The reason why this thought wasn't stolen was because he had lined up his subsequent actions. The lineup was filled with the same content. It didn't matter if the first thought was stolen, as it didn't affect the subsequent thoughts. This was a precious experience he had gained from fighting Aemon. Of course, if he were to meet Aemon again, he suspected that such a method might not work. Once the god of mischief was prepared, he would definitely come up with something new. As soon as he finished speaking, the eyes of the angel of the holy word angel, Steph, lit up with bolts of silver lightning. They covered the entirety of Noise City, and they tore through the darkness that enveloped the cathedral. They tore apart all the corruption, concealment, darkness, vileness, and evil. Inside, Klein and the sinister Gehrman Sparrow were situated at the eye of the lightning storm. Without even a grunt, they dissipated. Then, the terrifying, silvery white, twisted electric bolt snaked the area and swallowed the demonic wolf statue as well as the angel of holy words, Steph. Amidst the dull rumbling sounds, the ancient city of Noise completely collapsed, becoming a true ruin. At the opposite side of the dried-up river bed, Klein's historical projection quickly faded away, returning to the real world. Right on the heels of that, Klein immediately used Flaming Jump to distance himself from the Noise ruins. During this process, he pulled out a few paper figurines and made them into angels to cover his tracks. The desolate plains returned to its state of dead silence once again. After an unknown period of time, the ruins where the cathedral stood shook. Steph slowly stood up amidst crumbling dust and rock. His completely white hair had thinned again, and his deep black clergyman's robe became tattered. The angel of the holy word left Noise ancient city in silence, got his bearings, and walked deep into the darkness. Half a day later, a figure approached the city's ruins from another direction. It was none other than Klein, who had made a huge detour. He hadn't had the chance to check the ancient city of Noise previously, and his return this time was motivated by the hope of finding actual clues of that existence. At a relatively far distance away, Klein repeated his observations above the grey fog, summoned the historical projection, and hid in ancient times, using the projection to summon another historical projection. After finishing his preparations, he stepped into Noise once again and returned to the cathedral in absolute silence. Along the way, the corpses that had been lying dead on the ground had either turned to ash or turned to charred remains, devoid of that creepy and harrowing feeling. That fellow named Steph didn't die. From the looks of it, the remnant divine powers of Storm here can only injure an angel. Klein stopped in front of the ruined cathedral and muttered to himself wistfully. Of course, he only found it a little regretful. He didn't expect to finish off an angel so easily. As he swept his gaze, he saw a few pieces of the demonic wolf statue. The surface of it was dark black, and the insides were dark red, nothing like commonly seen stone. These stones must be extraordinary for them to be used by that dark demonic wolf for his statue. Furthermore, they don't look like something produced in the vicinity. Perhaps I can seek out the area the dark demonic wolf hid prior to Noise City by investigating them. As a miracle invoker, or even an attendant of mysteries, that dark demonic wolf must be good at covering his tracks. It'll be very difficult to track his whereabouts directly, but if I can find most of the areas he had hid previously, I should be able to gain insight into his habits and style. Once I know a person's past, I can predict his future. As he thought, he took 2 steps forward, bent down, and attempted to pick up a fragment of the statue. At that moment, a charred hand suddenly reached out and blocked his finger. From the corner of his eye, he saw a charred corpse standing up. The charred corpse's other hand held onto a crystal monocle and wore it on its left eye. Amen. Left eye. Klein's heart tightened at first before a strong sense of doubt and suspicion surfaced within him. In the next second, the charred corpse smiled and said, "Sorry, I wore it on the wrong side." As it spoke, it took off the monocle and moved it to its right eye. Once again, Klein understood why Amen was the god of mischief. At that moment, he didn't even have the desire to lampoon. All he wanted was to immediately end the historical projection and escape from the Amens, in front of him. The charred corpse that had been parasitized wiped the soot from its face. Before Klein disappeared, it said with a smile, "There's no rush. You are just a projection from the historical void. I can't really parasitize you, and you should know very well that I'm not alone. It's difficult for you to launch an effective counterattack." With a simple lantern in hand, Klein thought silently. He picked up a piece of the black sculpture fragment that had red insides, and he cautiously asked, "What exactly do you want to say?" At that moment, Amen had already changed back into his appearance. The only problem was that his skin remained darker. He adjusted his crystal monocle and chuckled. "You know that I'm aware that you're searching for that dark demonic wolf in an attempt to obtain the miracle invoker's beyond a characteristic from him. I happen to be very interested as well. Why don't we play another game and see who can get to it first? What's the point of that? It's not like I won't pursue it or think of snatching it if I don't play this game." After 2 seconds of silence, he shook his head. "I refuse." He had no intention of listening to what conditions Amen would offer. The more he heard from a top cheat, the more he would suffer. Amen shook his head without a hint of anger. "You'll regret this. I had originally planned to use a miracle invoker's beyond a characteristic to exchange for Sephira Castle with you, and also give you a period of time to transfer the secret gathering you organized. And now, I can only consider stealing your fate directly. I will carry the burden of the corrosion from the source. Yes, although it's dangerous, it's still thrilling enough. I'm already prepared to accept it and see who will eventually control the flow. With my father's experience, I believe I won't perform too poorly." What? Corrosion from the source? The experience of the ancient sun god. Klein originally didn't wish to continue discussing the topic of the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic and Sephira Castle, but when he heard that, his heart stirred. He recalled Amen's description and couldn't help but ask. The source refers to the oldest one, the first creator. He desperately wanted to know what sort of unbearable fate Sephira Castle would bring him. Amen pinched the edge of his monocle and looked at him for a few seconds before suddenly smiling. "It's better if I don't answer this question directly, as you won't believe every word I say. Tell me, I'll determine its authenticity." Klein suppressed the urge to blurt out and calmly replied, "Maybe it's just because you haven't made up the reason yet." Amen didn't mind at all as he smiled and said, "You can think of it that way too. Hey, at times, the truth that you discover for yourself is definitely more agreeable than what others tell you. If you have the time, you can wander around the forsaken land of the gods. This should provide you with more clues. Of course, if you have the guts to enter Chernobyl, then you would know more." Klein didn't pursue the matter any further. After staring at the collapsed cathedral that was bathed in a faint yellow light, he casually said, "Did the dark demonic wolf hurriedly migrate because of the discovery of your existence?" Amen nodded slightly and said, "It wasn't just me." He also sensed the hanged man's gaze. "He has been hiding in the forsaken land of the gods for thousands of years. He is very sensitive to such matters. A Sequence 2 angel, perhaps even a Sequence 1 angel, can only play hide and seek in the forsaken land of the gods and live such an abject life. Isn't the environment here a little too harsh?" Klein sighed inwardly before saying, "You must have left more than one avatar in the City of Silver. Why didn't you try to stop me from reviving there?" Why didn't you send more powerful avatars over? Eamon nudged the bottom of his monocle with his right index finger and laughed. If that happens, you'll choose to revive in the outside world. This will cause quite a bit of trouble for my follow-up tracking. And if we were to relax a little, due to the existence of the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic in the Forsaken Land of the Gods, you would most likely be resurrected here. In the following game, the only things that we need to consider are the Hanged Man and Ouroboros. Just as I thought. Klein said after some thought, even in the same region, as long as you exceed a certain distance, your true body and avatars have no way to instantly merge or switch locations. Back when you first entered the Forsaken Land of the Gods, you were able to transform back into your true form because the anomalies with Sephira Castle had similarly interfered with the area here, allowing your true body to sense something. You went to the entrance in advance to wait. After hearing what he said with a smile, Eamon asked without answering, "What's your guess? Why don't you guess if I've turned back into my original form?" Klein raised his right fist and covered his mouth. After pondering for a few seconds, he revealed a smile. "I guess your other avatars are setting up a corresponding ritual to allow your true body to descend directly." Before he could finish his sentence, his figure rapidly turned incorporeal and dissipated. The historical void projection was dispelled. In the wilderness outside the ancient city of Noise, the air around the hiding Klein suddenly stirred. In midair, there were a series of illusory monocles. They stared at Klein's figure, as if saying that they had finally found him. However, Klein's figure rapidly faded away. Back when Eamon moved the monocle to his right eye, Klein had already returned from ancient history to the real world. With the help of Paper Angel, he had used Flaming Jump and other Beyonder powers to quickly leave. The reason why his historical projection was able to speak to Eamon rather normally was because he was essentially a marionette. It was Kona's Kilgore in the form of Gehrman Sparrow. He had a worm of spirit that came from history inside him and was controlled by Klein's projection outside the city. Meanwhile, in the process of escaping far away, Klein frequently entered the historical void, allowing the projection outside the city to intermittently regain consciousness and maintain control of his marionette. This caused the person who had spoken to Eamon to fall into deep thought from time to time. He would either stare with a focused look for a few seconds or seemingly need time to recall what Eamon had said. Against the god of deceit, Klein didn't dare to be careless. After leaving Noise City, he circled around 2 more times and used his true vision to inspect his surroundings above the grey fog. Only then did he slow down. The corrosion that comes from the source. I wonder if Eamon is bluffing me. Indeed, I'll have to enter Chernobyl one day to take a look, but I have to become a miracle invoker, doing so after I have self-preservation abilities to a certain degree, otherwise, I'll just be knocking on death's door. With the lantern that Danitz had sacrificed, Klein casually proceeded in the dark environment of the weeds. Thanks to this experience, he finally had a deeper understanding of the danger in the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Extremely harsh and warped environment, crazy cultists, fallen angel, groups of Aemons wandering about, and mythical creatures lurking in the darkness. Somewhere here, there are evil gods watching everything. I can stir remnant divine powers that others can as well. As expected of the Forsaken Land of the Gods. The danger level far exceeds my imagination. As he sighed, he turned his attention back to the dark demonic wolf. To be frank, he didn't think he had any advantage in tracking this mythical creature. Be it his understanding of the Forsaken Land of the Gods, or his confidence in the target's situation, he was far inferior to Eamon, who had been exploring the area for more than 1,000 years, as well as the true creator's blessed who had the benefit of this place being their home ground. My only advantage is that I share the same seer pathway as the dark demonic wolf. Furthermore, I have Sephira Castle. There is a strong inclination for beyond a characteristic convergence. This will have a certain effect on fate and judgment. However, Eamon is a king of angels of a neighboring pathway. There is also the law of beyond a characteristic convergence between him and the dark demonic wolf. The effects won't be any weaker than mine. Klein considered carefully for a moment when he suddenly had an idea. He found his best advantage. The advantage was, he was very weak. Compared to Eamon, the true creator's attendant, and the dark demonic wolf, he was very weak. Under normal circumstances, this was a disadvantage, but at times, it was possible that it could bring him something that he wanted. My level is low, and I'm weak. That means that I can become the hunting target of the dark demonic wolf instead. It's very difficult for me to find him, so why don't I get him to come and find me instead? A scholar of yore might not necessarily interest the dark demonic wolf, but if this scholar of yore can still trigger Sephira Castle, that's a whole other matter. I can stir Sephira Castle from time to time, leaving behind traces of the grey fog's aura as bait for the dark demonic wolf. The more he thought, the more viable he believed it was. Of course, this was definitely very dangerous. If he wasn't careful, he might accidentally bait Amon or even the true creator. And the dark demonic wolf might very likely choose to observe first before suddenly launching an attack and not giving him a chance to prepare. Before taking this approach, I have to make sufficient preparations. There's no need to rush it. Taking a deep breath, Klein reached out his hand and pulled out the black demonic wolf sculpture's fragment that was red on the inside. Although he had failed to obtain the item due to Amon's obstruction, this didn't stop him from taking it out from the historical void. This was because he had already seen it and had touched it. And the item itself wasn't at a high level. At this moment, he wanted to use the fragment to search for the hiding spot of the dark demonic wolf by analyzing it in reverse and figuring out its modus operandi. In the wilderness ruled by darkness, Klein lifted the lantern that emitted a faint yellow light. He got his bearings and changed directions before slowly entering Backland, Hillston Borough. Fors, who had gone out, traveling, once, finally received a reply from her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham. There are no worms of star at the moment. He wants me to take note of what else the person who's seeking to purchase a worm of star needs. Fors read the letter from her teacher and silently heaved a sigh of relief. However, when she thought about how she was about to begin hunting the Saint of Secrets, she felt a pang of nervousness. After all, he was a demigod, a saint who had reached Sequence 4 about 1 or 2 years ago. It was unknown if he was already at Sequence 3 now. Although the mastermind behind the operation is Ma'am Hermit, as the bait, I still need to worry about my own safety. Besides, the Aurora Order still has Rose Redemption backing him, as well as angels and a King of Angels. Fors didn't regret agreeing to Gairman Sparrow's request. This was something she had wanted to do in the first place. However, due to the high risk involved, it was inevitable for her to feel flustered and uneasy. This made her think of another possibility: if Mr. World could participate in the operation and lead it, I'll definitely feel less nervous and worried. It wasn't that Fors didn't believe in Ma'am Hermit's strength and experience, but that the results from the World Gairman Sparrow were laid bare for all to see. His hunts didn't include 1 or 2 demigods, so having him run the operation would make one feel at ease. Zio, who was sitting beside the fireplace, glanced at her friend and asked, "Is the hunt about to begin?" "Yes." Fors nodded solemnly before saying, "It won't be too soon. Everyone needs some time to prepare." Hunting a demigod wasn't akin to fox hunting in the suburbs during autumn. Setting off wasn't as simple as bringing the equipment and gathering friends. This required a precise and meticulous plan. Fors believed that Ma'am Hermit had to come to Backland personally, or live in another killbox that she had decided on for some time. Only by figuring out the exact situation could she come up with an effective plan. As for Miss Justice, she was still speeding up the digestion of her Dreamwalker potion. This might take another 1 to 2 months or even longer. For Fors, she could afford to wait. She also wanted to finish digesting her scribe potion, set up the ritual, and become a traveler before the actual operation began. The only thing she wasn't sure of was whether the world would rush them. "I will try my best to convince him." "No, let Miss Justice convince him. That's what a spectator is best at." Just as Fors mumbled, she saw Zio turn around and hesitantly say, "The liaison officer from MI9 suggested that I should officially join him today. And they said that, with the new king in place, there are many matters from the past that I don't need to worry about. People like me and him have the chance to have importance placed on them again." Fors listened attentively and said after some deliberation, "That isn't some sort of investigation that's targeted at us, right? This will likely make them discover that there's a faction behind you." Zio nodded and said, "They believe that I was abandoned after that incident. Also, they suspect that that faction belongs to a church, the Church of Evernite." Zio believed in the Evernite goddess, so mentioning the church was undoubtedly referring to the Church of Evernite. However, considering that her good friend was a believer in the god of steam and machinery, she made an emphasis to prevent any ambiguity. Hey, that's what Mr. World told us to disguise ourselves as." Fors stroked her hair with a relaxed expression and said with a smile. She then made herself look serious and mature. "Zio, this is an opportunity for you. Acting as a judge clearly requires the support of the officials. Your current strength and level aren't enough to be a judge in the underground world in Backland. You also lack sufficient support. If you can really enter a court of law, rotate between the different courts, and serve in a criminal court for a few months, your potion should be completely digested. Oh right, I heard that MI9 has a paranormal court within it, one which specializes in beyonder cases. If you become a judge there, you might be able to attempt to be a disciplinary paladin by February or March next year. Seeing Zio clearly being moved by her speech, Fors hurriedly added, once you make enough contributions, you might be able to restore your father's reputation to a certain extent. Anyway, George III is already dead. As long as it doesn't affect his reputation, Jevington too might not stop it. Jevington was the eldest son of George III. He had worn the crown as Balam's emperor and was now the new king of Loan. Zio fell silent for a while before she slowly nodded. I'll give it a try. Yes, after things settle down, you can bring your mother and brother to Backland. Although the situation is tense now and food prices are rapidly rising, you definitely get food rations from MI9. You can provide for them. The more Fors spoke, the more she felt that joining MI9 was a good thing. After persuading Zio, Fors entered her bedroom and prayed to Mr. Fool, asking him to forward her message to Mr. World. Immediately following that, Fors extracted the important points of her teacher's reply and described her thoughts, hoping that Gaemon Sparrow could be more patient. Just as she finished her prayers and was about to leave the room, her vision suddenly blurred. She saw a crimson tide surge out of the void, instantly drowning her. Fors immediately discovered that she had arrived in the ancient palace and was sitting on her usual high-back chair. However, there was no towering figure that was shrouded in grey fog at the long, bronze table's seat of honor. At that moment, there was only her and the world Gaemon Sparrow around the long mottled table. Fors's mind suddenly tensed up as her thoughts raced suddenly. Mr. World, I meant, just now, that it's best if you have some patience. This will make things simpler. It's actually fine if you don't. We will begin hunting as soon as possible. Klein let out a soft chuckle. Don't worry, I'm not in a hurry. When his ultimate goal had become an angel-level potion formula and grade 0 sealed artifacts, he had enough patience regarding this matter. Phew. Fors secretly heaved a sigh of relief and asked curiously, then why did you look for me? Klein replied calmly, didn't you wish to digest the scribe potion as quickly as possible? Apart from the customs of different places, I think you still need to record all kinds of beyonder powers. The higher the corresponding level, the better the digestion's effect. Fors's eyes lit up when she heard that. Yes. After blurting it out, she found her attitude highly questionable. She hurriedly and fearfully added, is this the advance payment you mentioned before? Klein nodded slightly and said, let's begin. Be prepared. I've borrowed a grade 1 sealed artifact from Mr. Fool. It corresponds to the level of a Sint. To a sequence 6 scribe, the chances of successfully recording an angel level beyond a power was extremely low, nearly impossible. Therefore, Klein didn't attempt to summon Miss Messenger and Mr. Azek from the historical void to showcase the skills. Fors sat up straight and nodded heavily. Yes. In the next second, she saw the world Gaemon Sparrow raise a white bone scepter covered in blue gems. Amidst the bright light, bolts of lightning leaped out of the void and interwove together, forming a forest of lightning that emitted an aura of destruction. Fors's eyes turned silvery white as her body and mind were left in awe. After the lightning storm calmed down, she was stunned for 2 seconds before timidly saying, it failed. Again, Klein calmly replied. Lightning storm descended again and again in the ancient palace above the grey fog. After an unknown period of time, Fors exhaled and leaned back in her chair. She couldn't hide her joy as she said, it's a success. It's a success. She had finally recorded lightning storm once. It's finally over. Fors immediately relaxed. Then, she heard the world say without emotion, all right, next beyond a power. Next. Fors saw the crazy adventurer at the bottom of the long, mottled table extend his right hand and grab at the grayish-white fog. Out of nowhere, he took out a long, thorny cross that was covered in bronze. Record this cross's ability. Fors tried hard to make her expression appear normal. After she digested the scribe potion to a certain extent, the godhood powers that she could record had increased from 1 to 2. No. Klein glanced at Miss Magician and said, record my summoning of the unshadowed crucifix. It failed, Fors said softly. The reason for her failure this time was that she didn't have time to record it. Dispelling the maintenance of unshadowed crucifix, Klein once again reached into the fog of history and pulled out an iron-black revolver. It didn't succeed. Fawes replied with a complicated expression. All she wanted to do now was to return to the real world and digest what she had just received, but the ringing of the bell to mark the end of class just didn't happen. Nearly 30 times later, when Fawes's head throbbed in pain and her mental strength was beginning to run dry, she finally recorded historical void summoning once. At that moment, she felt her tears fill her eyes, but she still held back her fatigue and tried her best to show the attitude of a good student. This can summon people and objects that one is related to through the historical void. When the time comes, who should I summon, or what item should I summon? Klein looked at Miss Magician and coldly replied, me. Quote ellipsis quote. Fawes forced a smile and asked, from which period? The last time we met. Klein had already thought of an answer. It was the him who had deliberately sent Miss Magician back from the world of ice and snow to Backland before he destroyed George III's ritual. He had already become a scholar of yore by then. Fawes nodded solemnly and subconsciously asked, what if I fail? For me to summon someone who exceeds my own level, the probability of failure should be very high. Come again tomorrow to record this ability. Use Leymano's travels, Klein said calmly. Will 2 times be enough to succeed? Fawes instinctively had such a question. However, she didn't dare to speak when she saw how certain the world Gairman Sparrow was about it. She raised her hand and gestured. Then, can I go back now? With a terse answer, he allowed Miss Magician to leave Sephira Castle with a delighted expression. In a primitive forest on Sonia Island, Alger Wilson led his subordinates into an elven ruin that was seldom visited. Report chapter. The withered vines drooped down, covering the rotting wooden structure. The entire ruins had been frozen in a silent atmosphere that no one had tread within for a while. Alger and a few sailors circled around the ruin in the environment of a withering winter, but they still failed to discover anything of value. Captain, batches of adventurers have come here before. What else could they have left us? Finally, a sailor in his 30s impatiently broke the silence. This resonated with his other companions as they echoed, a place that didn't take us much time to learn about can definitely be easily found by others. That's right, that's right. Let's continue to F*K the Phasations. Captain, are you trying to make this place a stronghold? Alger slowly scanned the area, quelling the sailors to stop their complaints under his gaze and making them choose to obey. After a few seconds of silence, he said, I plan on using this place to ambush the Phasations. Let's observe the terrain and see if it's suitable. With such an excuse, the sailors barely perked up, and the group quickly entered the depths of the elven ruins. As he walked, Alger's spiritual perception was triggered as he subconsciously looked behind a gigantic tree. There were some signs of churning in the soil over there, and it wouldn't take more than a year. Alger retracted his gaze and pretended not to notice anything amiss. He naturally looked elsewhere. After exploring the elven ruins, they returned to their new camp. At that moment, it was almost evening and the forest was getting colder. Alger had dinner with the sailors before leaving 2 patrolling guards behind, and then all of them entered their respective tents. The cold wind blew through the trees, causing the bonfire to sway. Alger, who had wanted to leave the campsite in the middle of the night, suddenly heard faint singing from afar. The voice was ethereal, like a woman humming and singing slowly, relating her inner thoughts. This made Alger involuntarily recall the past. He recalled his mother who had long passed away, and the days when he was a bullied child. Indescribable grief surged from the bottom of his heart, preventing him from waking up immediately. He waited for a few seconds before he suddenly sat up, frowning and listening. This time, he didn't hear anything. That melodious voice seemed to have never happened. Alger narrowed his eyes, grabbed his thick jacket, and put it on. He walked out of the tent and came to the bonfire. The 2 sailors in charge of night duty had just finished their patrol and were drawing warmth from it. Did you discover anything unusual? Alger asked in a deep voice. The 2 strong, vigorous sailors shook their heads. No. Alger's brows relaxed a little as he turned around, intending to make his own rounds. At this moment, he noticed something from the corner of his eye. The 2 sailors were too close. If it were any ordinary pirate, this wouldn't have been a problem. However, Alger's subordinates had undergone formal training through the Church of the Lord of Storms. They definitely knew that, in such an environment, the patrol team had to maintain a certain distance from each other. They couldn't be too far or too close. They had to be able to see their companions, as well as prevent themselves from being taken away at the same time from a single assault. Alger took 2 steps without batting an eyelid. He turned back and casually asked, "Did you discover anything normal?" He had changed the question and made it appear very strange. The 2 strong sailors shook their heads and replied without changing their expressions, "No." "No." Alger nodded slightly with a relaxed expression. "Very good." He turned around and slowly walked into his tent. The moment the sailors' attention on him was cut off, Alger drew out the blade of poison and the gargoyle glasses. He opened his mouth and prepared to belt out a song. At that moment, the ethereal voice from before appeared once again. It echoed in Alger's ears and pierced into his mind. This was an extremely ancient folk song, spelling out an extreme sense of sadness and melancholy through the singing. It made Alger's spirit body produce pale, non-existent arms that constantly tore at him. Alger's expression twisted as his skin began to produce slippery, black fish scales. His dark blue hair stood up one by one as they became abnormally thick. The thoughts that originally existed in his mind were disrupted by the song and were cut off by the pain. They were unable to take form any further. Alger fell and struggled on the ground. He squirmed, becoming less and less like a human as he was pushed to the brink of losing control. Suddenly, the singing stopped. A slightly indifferent voice entered Alger's ears, "Some elven blood. Then, that shall be all. Use sea artists beyond a characteristic well." Alger's forehead was covered in cold sweat as he slowly got up. He didn't know when a figure had appeared in the tent. It was a woman with black hair and exquisite facial features. Her ears were slightly pointy, and her eyes were deep. Her facial features were soft, and she wore a complicated and ancient long dress. Even though she didn't have the advantage in height, she still gave off an air of superiority. "Are you the Elf Queen, Queen of Calamity Kahinem?" A thought flashed through Alger's mind as he took the initiative to ask. The woman played with a beautifully decorated golden cup and calmly said, "Haven't you already met me?" Alger suddenly recalled the similar singing he had heard on Parsu Island. He recalled seeing a high elf when he entered the underwater coral palace. After a few seconds of silence, Alger said in a deep voice, "You're actually still alive." At the same time, he silently recited Mr. Fool's honorific name in his heart, but he didn't know if it would be effective if he didn't recite it out loud. The black-haired woman's expression remained unchanged as she replied, "It's very difficult for an angel to perish without encountering an enemy. Then why did you split the characteristics and place yourself to be in a strange state? This makes you need to wait for an opportunity to be resurrected." Alger had learned of the corresponding situation at the Tarot Club, and now, he was asking out of curiosity, partly to stall for time. The elven lady suspected to be Queen of Calamity Kahinem snorted. "Because the divine throne for Storm is occupied by Leodero, and I have no way of resisting the tyrant. Also, the elves are dwindling in numbers. My anchors are becoming increasingly unstable." Other people might not know who Leodero was, but Alger knew very well. He didn't dare continue this topic in the real world. Just as he was about to ask the Queen of Calamity Kahinem's goal for coming, the Elf Queen said, "Do you want to become a demigod?" "She wants to use my body to revive. She wants to use my wish to advance to sequence 4 and obtain godhood as bait to intrude my body." While Alger was tempted, questions arose in his mind. Considering how Mr. Fool could cleanse all kinds of corruption, Alger acutely felt that this was an opportunity. This made him recall a term Emperor Roselle had once mentioned, a Trojan horse. And now, he had a high chance of bringing in the Trojan horse and throwing out the invaders within. "What do you want me to do?" Alger didn't appear too anxious as he raised a question based on his personality. Queen of Calamity Kahinem observed him for a few seconds before saying, "When you have the right to make contact with the Book of Calamity, take out something that no one else will notice, and take it to the Western Continent." The Western Continent, the legendary homeland of the elves. Alger frowned slightly and said, "Hasn't the Western Continent already disappeared?" The corners of Kahinem's lips curled up slightly. "Since it disappeared, it will reappear again. It will definitely appear again when the apocalypse happens." Without waiting for Alger to ask further, the Elf Queen paused and said, "You don't have to personally send that item to the Western Continent, but you have to entrust someone trustworthy. Although I'm not skilled at curses, I can still make you die in pain from breaking our agreement. But what if the Western Continent doesn't appear again, or if it can't be entered?" Alger thought seriously for a moment. Kahinem, with her gentle gaze and lustrous raven black hair, seemed to be lost in beautiful memories. After a few seconds, she calmly said, "If it really doesn't appear again, then the agreement shall be null and void. Perhaps entering the Western continent requires an incantation or command, but I do not know what it is. However, you can ask a particular existence." "Who?" Alger asked, puzzled. Kahinem glanced at him and coldly said, "The Mr. Fool you were chanting in your heart just now. I have a feeling that he is the key to this matter." Alger's heart tightened as he hurriedly lowered his head in response. "I understand." Seeing this, Queen of Calamity Kahinem nodded slightly and said, "If you wish to become a demigod and abide by this agreement, you can head to the Elven ruins when the sun rises." After the voice fell, the Elf Queen's figure quickly dissipated, like a mirage that was often seen at sea and in the desert. Alger suddenly opened his eyes and realized that he was lying in a tent, having just woken up. His memories were in a mess, but he quickly regulated them. He and his sailors had just found the location of an elven ruin and had yet to explore it. The previous exploration, singing, sailor anomalies, and appearance and conversation with Calamity were all just a dream. It's no wonder I was so careless. Even though I knew that I might encounter the Queen of Calamity, I didn't pray to Mr. Fool first. The Queen of Calamity relied on her status as an angel to create this realistic dream. Or perhaps, she has a corresponding sealed artifact. Even if she exists in a special state, she still has the means to use her powers. Alger listened to the commotion outside the tent, and he realized that everything was normal. He then sat down and prayed sincerely to Mr. Fool. In just 20 to 30 seconds, Alger arrived above the grey fog and saw Mr. Fool sitting at the end of the long, mottled table. "You met Kahinem." After the hanged man greeted him, the Fool Klein spoke casually. Alger answered seriously, "Yes, but I can't be sure that it's the Elf Queen." The Fool acknowledged softly and didn't deny the hanged man's guess, nor was he certain that it was Queen of Calamity Kahinem. After all, it was impossible for him to take out a gold coin in front of him and perform a divination on the spot. Alger waited for a few seconds. Seeing no clear response from Mr. Fool, he quickly went into greater detail about what he had said in the prayer. From the woman suspected to be Queen of Calamity Kahinem saying that he had some elven blood in him, to how she gave him a promise of becoming a demigod, as well as the key to the Western continent and the completion of the agreement. After recounting everything, Alger shut his mouth and lowered his head, not daring to directly ask Mr. Fool what he thought. He obediently waited for the great existence to speak. "Some elven blood. Send something from the Book of Calamity to the Western continent. The missing Western continent might reappear again." The Western continent. The Fool Klein listened quietly. He closed his eyes and calmly said, "This is very dangerous, but this is also an opportunity for you." He had already gained initial control of Sephira Castle, and the power he could mobilize had reached the level of a Sequence 2 angel. As for Queen of Calamity Kahinem, she couldn't be higher than this level, therefore, he was quite confident that he could resist the various accidents brought about by the Elf Queen. It was precisely because of this that he dared to claim it to be an opportunity for the hanged man. Of course, the prerequisite for grasping the opportunity was that the hanged man wasn't rash or went overboard. He had to constantly remember to ask for protection at all times. Therefore, Klein specially emphasized that it was very dangerous. He wanted the hanged man to remember to pray to Mr. Fool before he took action. This short sentence had two meanings to it, but he believed that Mr. Hanged Man would definitely understand it. Alger was delighted as he replied rather sincerely, as though he had learned from the sun. "My faith lies only with Mr. Fool." These words made Klein feel uneasy as he remembered the pain of being drowned by endless lightning. He could only smile without saying a word. Alger deliberated for a moment before asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, what are the incantations or commands needed to enter the Western continent? I would like to know that too." The Fool Klein sighed and said, "It's not time for you to know." "Yes, Mr. Fool." Alger didn't ask further as he bowed respectfully. When he returned to the real world, he immediately walked out of the tent and led his sailors out. Under the light of the morning sun, he spent a certain amount of time reaching the elven ruin. The scene here was identical to what he had seen in his dream. The withered vines covered the decaying wooden structure, and there were some areas where the text on monuments could be seen. The air seemed to have frozen, as though no one had stepped in for a long time. Looking around, Alger suddenly thought of a question. How was he to face the church after he really relied on the Queen of Calamity to become a demigod? Directly rebel, becoming the fifth king over the 5 seas, no, the 6th king. But this way, I won't have a chance to come into contact with the Book of Calamity. Unless I design a situation that forces the Church to use this sealed artifact that might have been labeled as Grade 0 without my knowledge. That will not only be very difficult, but I have to become a Sea King, or even a Calamity to succeed. Yes, I can request the world's help. If I wish to continue staying in the Church, I have to give them a reason that they cannot ignore but is sufficiently believable. Alger frowned slightly without hiding his solemnity. In the eyes of the sailors who followed him, this was a sign that he was worried about the ruin. As his thoughts churned, Alger gradually came up with ideas. There are many books in the Church that have records of people turning into demigods due to a fortuitous encounter. 2/3 of them were invaded by evil gods and devils and eventually lost their lives in the purification process. However, 1/3 of them passed the test and became a high-ranking deacon or a cardinal. Now that the war has broken out, the situation in Loen is tense. As long as there aren't any problems during the investigation, the Church wouldn't mind having an additional Sequence 4 demigod as cannon fodder. Then, I can slowly gain their trust later. The prerequisite for all of this is that the Queen of Calamity hasn't truly attempted to corrupt me or left a mark on me. Considering the various sealed artifacts in the Church's possession, I have to pray for Mr. Fool's blessings ahead of time. According to Miss Justice, Angel's Embrace can effectively hide one's true thoughts and tests in one's dream. With the members of the Tarot Club beginning to become demigods or about to become demigods, Alger really didn't wish to be lining the bottom of the barrel. Just like in the past, he had done so many things in the Church, all for the sake of being superior to others. Now, he was naturally willing to take a certain risk. With this decision, Alger immediately led his sailors into the ruins and began exploring the path in his dreams. This time, he didn't split his subordinates into small teams. On the one hand, he was worried that an accident might occur, and on the other hand, he hoped that they could all be his witness. After 15 minutes, Alger and his crew arrived beside the giant tree that had signs of its soil being churned. Before he could survey his surroundings, his vision blurred, and he saw a gorgeous palace made up of coral. Above the palace was a layer of deep blue seawater that rippled outwards. Giant pillars stood tall and held up an exaggerated dome. It was tall and beautiful, but also dark and gloomy. Alger looked around and realized that all the sailors beside him had disappeared. He immediately knew that he might have been pulled into an illusion. He took a silent breath and slowly walked into the coral palace. There were many elves inside. They were either roasting fish or placing spices in the coagulated animal blood. Their choice of utensil was 2 tree branches to bring the food to their mouths. None of them minded the entrance of a stranger. Alger then cast his gaze to the 9 starred stairs 100 meters away. On the steps, there was a coral throne inlaid with sapphires, emerald, and lustrous pearls. The elf queen, Queen of Calamity, was sitting there, looking down at Alger. Very good. Kahinum nodded and threw out the exquisite gold wine glass. The gentle but resilient wind held the wine cup in its embrace and, like tiny pixies in a line, carried the corresponding items towards Alger. Alger reached out to receive it and looked down. He discovered that there was a blue liquid inside the golden cup. It was incorporeal, dreamy, and surreal. Drink it, and then head to the waters near the Simeme Island of the Rorstad archipelago. Find this coral palace. The thing you want is inside. If I don't drink this wine, I won't be able to see that palace. Alger asked thoughtfully. Although he was facing an angel, he was still able to communicate rather calmly. This was because he met a mighty figure every week and was already used to this situation. Queen of Calamity Kahinum nodded and said, "That's right. Will you leave a mark on me?" Alger asked cautiously. "Yes," Kahinum said coldly. "So, before entering the Coral Palace and obtaining the corresponding items, you can't return to Parsu Island. You can't meet the angels under Leodero. The Pontiff can't be met even if I want to." Alger heaved a sigh of relief inwardly before asking, "After I get hold of that item, the effect of this wine will disappear?" Elf Queen Kahinum replied without any change in expression, "No, you need to directly consume that characteristic. When the time comes, this wine will transform into a seal, allowing that characteristic to temporarily not invade your body. How you prepare the ritual and explain this to the Church of Storms will be up to you. Let the characteristic belong to me first before holding the ritual. This way, there might be a better way for the Church to accept it." Alger thought for a moment before raising his hand to bring the wine cup to his lips. The ice-cold liquid slid down his throat and disappeared in a blink of an eye. The entire coral palace shattered as the light of dawn and the remnants of the gigantic green tree reappeared in front of Alger. You didn't sign a contract or get me to swear an oath. Yes, drinking a cup of wine is equivalent to making an agreement. Alger retracted his gaze and said to the surrounding sailors who were unaware, "There's nothing here. Let's go deeper and take a look." Ellipsis. In the ancient palace above the fog. Klein also retracted his gaze from the crimson star representing the hanged man and nodded thoughtfully. "That's Ciata's and Mobit's grave. I never expected that golden wine cup to have such an effect. That is indeed Elf Queen Kahinem. How's her present condition? Half of it is in the Book of Calamity, while the other is hiding somewhere unknown. She was using the golden wine cup or the characteristic to influence reality. Mr. Hanged Man hasn't been contaminated for the time being. I'll wait for him to head to the Rorstad archipelago before making another assessment." As his true body had a limited amount of time left in the historical void, Klein didn't stay any longer, and he returned to the pitch-black wilderness. He carried the lantern that emitted a faint yellow light as he walked towards a certain location. As he walked, he turned his head to look east, which was symbolic of where Chernobyl was. His footsteps slowed down involuntarily. "Once I gather sufficient information from the dark demonic wolf's former hiding spots, I'll head east. I'll walk all the way until I reach the boundary and confirm the situation. Then, I'll consider the matter of the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic. Eamon probably wouldn't expect that I would suddenly leave. He definitely knows the past of the dark demonic wolf. It's impossible for him to do the same kinds of investigations that I'll be doing. Yes, but he will definitely be tracking me." Klein exhaled slowly and sped up his pace. A bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the dark and red desolate plains. Raindrops began dripping down intermittently. Klein dragged out a black umbrella from the historical void. With one hand holding an umbrella and the other holding the lantern, he proceeded alone. Ellipsis. About a week later, the Future was docked somewhere along the long Loen coastline. Katlia held a stack of tarot cards in her hand and said to the sailors, "Nina and company, I'll be staying in Loen for some time. All of you have to watch Frank and prevent him from doing his strange experiments." Upon hearing the captain's instructions, Nina pouted and pointed out the window. "Are any of Frank's experiments not strange?" Katlia was momentarily at a loss for words. All she could do was sigh and say, "If there are any signs of danger, write to me immediately." As a mysticologist, she also had her own messenger. "All right." Nina puffed her chest out and said, "If there's anything to blame, it's solely because I'm the most mature and reliable person on the Future." Having said that, she asked curiously, "Captain, what are you doing in Loen? What mission did you take on? Are you going to engage in some sabotage raids behind enemy lines?" Nina was of Phasation descent, and she was considered half Intis. She naturally had some inclinations in the recent war, therefore, she guessed that her captain had established contact with Intis's intelligence department. "You could say that," Katlia replied sternly. In a sense, Nina's guess wasn't wrong. She had indeed taken on a mission and was dealing damage in Loen's capital, Backland. However, her target wasn't an official faction, but a cultist. Furthermore, there's still a chance to meet the Queen. She probably hasn't left Backland yet, and the earliest she'll leave is probably after the new year. Upon thinking of this, Katlia suddenly felt a little excited. Ever since she left the Dawn, she hadn't really met Queen Mystic. She only had letters to communicate with her, or despite being on the same boat, they didn't communicate with one another for some reason. Nina didn't dare to press further as she pointed to the door and said, "Captain, is there anything else? If not, we'll leave." Katlia nodded, indicating that this future bosun could leave with her subordinates. Just as Nina held the handle and gently twisted it, Katlia suddenly recalled something and hurriedly shouted, "Nina." Nina, whose blonde hair was tied into a high ponytail, turned around with a confused expression. "Don't drink," Katlia emphasized seriously. "When I return to the ship, you'll be allowed to have your fill." Nina immediately revealed a charming smile. "Deal." Katlia thought for a moment before exhorting, "Apart from Frank, you have to take note of Heath's condition. Don't let him generate curiosity towards unknown voices, and don't let him be overly exhausted. Also, pull Ottolov out of his room frequently, and control the frequency and times he interacts with mysticism knowledge. Also, I know. Don't I know them all too well?" Nina waved her hand and agreed. After the bosun and her subordinates left the captain's cabin and closed the door behind them, Katlia cast her gaze out the window to look at the currently invisible Backland. After a few minutes, she took out a tarot card from the deck in her hand. It depicted a lonely old man with a glass lantern and a staff, the Hermit card. Late at night, Backland, Empress Borough, Earl Hall's house. Audrey, who was wearing a white silk nightgown, suddenly opened her eyes. She took a blue cloak and draped it over her body. She then got out of bed and walked to the full-body mirror in the room. Through the crimson moonlight shining through the curtains, she carefully observed herself. Her pair of emerald green eyes seemed to glow brightly and limpid. It was so clear that one could clearly see every detail. Audrey closed her eyes. By the time she opened them again, all the abnormalities had vanished. The corners of her mouth curled up bit by bit, and a small depression appeared on her face. Her eyes curved slightly as she silently praised herself. Audrey, you've finally come this far. She had completely digested the Dreamwalker potion. According to her confidence in herself, and her predictions, she had originally believed that it would take until February for her to digest the potion. To her surprise, she had encountered many strange and completely different dreams recently. This included many dreams within dreams, dreams that were a result of a mental illness, lucid dreams, dreams caused by the influence of evil spirits and wraiths, and the dreams of a few demigods. Under normal circumstances, as a dreamwalker, Audrey could generally determine the creature's level when entering a dream, thus avoiding danger. However, those demigods had hidden themselves very well. Only when she entered the dreams did she realize that something was amiss and nearly jumped in fright. Fortunately, she wasn't discovered all those times. She ended up accumulating experience, and she began carefully touring, traveling, observing, and analyzing in the demigod's dreams, allowing her to greatly digest her potion. In addition, the other special dreams gave her a completely different experience. After that, she attempted creating multiple dreams within dreams. Some attempted to hide behind the scenes in her dreams and guide them in an ingenious manner to develop and interfere with the subconscious in a reverse manner. She treated the mental illness of the owners of the dreams, or the corruption caused by an evil spirit or wraith. To a certain extent, she had gone against the requirements of only observing, recording, and not making any interference. Yet, this strangely accelerated the digestion of the potion. This made her conclude a new principle: if you really want to interfere, then be the mastermind and conductor behind the scenes. It's so that even if the goal succeeds, no one will notice it. This was something that Audrey had done very well. The few people with serious mental illnesses had unknowingly recovered after having 5 or 6 strange dreams. And it was very normal for a dream to appear strange and incomprehensible. To be able to digest the Dreamwalker potion so quickly, it's mainly a result of my good luck recently. Without so many unique experiences, I'd definitely have to wait another month or 2. Yes, I might even be caught by a demigod and be thrown into a beyond a prison or directly be killed. When did my luck become so good? It seems like it started after I sacrificed the ice cream to that Fate Domains angel. His blessed. Audrey looked at her reflection and blinked her eyes with a smile. She quickly retracted her gaze, scanned her bedroom, and walked to the dressing table. Sitting on it was a deck of cards. In a room of a girl who enjoyed mysticism, it was normal for her to have a deck of tarot cards. Audrey stretched out her right hand and touched the card at the top with her fingertip. She slowly took a deep breath and muttered to herself, "The fighting at the Amantha mountain range is getting more intense." Midseisha had already lost a port. It said that the defenses of the Hornachus mountain range in Sivelaus County can't last until spring. If not for the fact that we have gained a significant advantage at sea, our connection with the southern continent's East Balam would have surely been severed. Alfred is still there. I wonder how this war will develop. Thankfully, I'm about to become a demigod. Mr. World has already given me the manipulator's potion formula and main ingredient. The 7 drops of tears that were shed from intense human emotions have also been found during my dream experience recently. The tree mentor's golden leaves were obtained via a trade with Little Sun. I'm just short of the blood of an elderly mind dragon. Phew, I'll try to trade for it with the psychology alchemists. Before Vin Rambus died, I was already the person in charge of a small psychological discussion group. But will this reveal that Vin Rambus's death has something to do with me? Or could I get Mr. World to summon the blood of an elderly mind dragon from history? This can last for at least 15 minutes. When I succeed in advancing, I'll converge my spirituality and complete my queuing. Its disappearance will not affect anything. After all, it's just a supplementary material. Audrey, you actually learned how to fake things. What's more, it's on such matters. After a self-deprecating comment, Audrey began to think about the kind of situation to use to complete the advancement ritual of a manipulator. The ritual required one to drink the potion while in the midst of an emotional resonance generated during a special occasion with at least 10,000 people. As her thoughts raced, Audrey came up with a preliminary idea: the goddess's winter gifts day. But no matter how large a mass is, it can't accommodate 10,000 people. The cathedral can't accommodate so many people. Yes, it's usually impossible. If there's a chance, I can donate a sum of money. I can suggest we do an extremely large mass in Memorial Square so as to placate the souls that passed away during the war. In the most important square, the family members, relatives, and friends of the deceased are invited. As long as they accommodate a certain proportion of the participants, the emotions that resonate will affect the others who are participating in mass, allowing the ritual's requirements to be satisfied. After calmly analyzing the situation, Audrey suddenly bowed her head and looked at the mirror on the dressing table. She saw that the faint smile on her beautiful face had long disappeared, leaving behind only calmness and sadness in her eyes. She stared at herself, her lips curling up slightly as she whispered, "Audrey, you've become despicable." Closing her eyes and opening them again, Audrey had returned to normal. She reached out to the stack of tarot cards on the dressing table and flipped the card at the top. The card depicted a goddess of justice sitting on a stone chair with a sword in one hand and a balance in the other, coldly watching everything. Backland, Hillston Borough, in a house with a fireplace. "You've finished digesting your scribe potion." Zio had just changed into her home clothes when she heard the piece of unbelievable news upon walking back to the living room. Foles nodded with a haggard expression. "Yes. Do you know what kind of life I've been enduring recently?" As she was being forced to travel to 6 places in a consecutive manner, she had to experience, admire, and record the sights day and night. In addition, she would be pulled up above the gray fog, recording all kinds of strange or high-level beyond the powers. The lightning storm and the historical void summoning powers had been replaced several times. They had finally recovered their original setup today. "I don't know," Zio answered honestly. "I know you don't know." Foles took a deep breath and said, "What about you? How have you been recently?" "Not too bad. It was arranged for me to preside over a paranormal court, and I had some thoughts about the acting principles." "The speed at which the potion is being digested has increased," Zio acknowledged. "I find it hard to imagine you wearing a judge's robe and sitting at the tribunal's seat to judge." Foles sighed from the bottom of her heart. "Are you trying to say that the prisoners and lawyers won't be able to see me?" Zio added, not minding it at all. Foles laughed dryly and said, "I'll need to have some rest to prepare my advancement ritual to become a traveler." "Don't you need to go deep into the spirit world? Do you have a way?" Zio asked in puzzlement. Foles nodded and said, "That person asked me to summon his messenger." Summon his messenger. As judgment of the Tarot Club, as a member of Me9, Zio understood what a messenger meant. Furthermore, she knew that the middle ranks of the numinous episcopate widely used messengers. Before she could ask for more details, she saw Foles walk towards the guest room on the first floor with her eyes vacant and footsteps listless. She said with an ethereal voice, "Let me sleep for a while. We can talk later." She slept all the way till the next morning, waking up thanks to the aroma of meat. Desi pie. Foles rubbed her eyes and walked out of the room. She saw that the table was already filled with food. "Yes." Zio came out of the bathroom. "The one from the corner of the street. It's not bad." Foles enthusiastically acknowledged and sat beside the dining table. She quickly picked up the desi pie and stuffed it into her mouth. After finishing one, she drank a mouthful of sweet iced tea and sighed in satisfaction. "This is life. Oh no, I forgot to brush my teeth." After she was done washing up, she finally regained her ability to think. She looked at Zio in puzzlement and said, "Did MI9 not have any suspicions about how you secretly became a judge?" "They thought it was the remuneration that motivated me back then," Zio informed her of what she had learned. Foles stroked her hair and said with a smile, "That's true. Let them ask the Church of Evernite." She covered her mouth and yawned. "I'm going to summon that messenger." After this period of recording, the way she addressed Klein had changed from Gairman Sparrow and Mr. World to that person. On the one hand, it was a form of respect, and on the other hand, she was afraid that someone would eavesdrop. Upon hearing her friend's words, Zio looked around and asked in confusion, "Aren't you going to set up the ritual?" She remembered that summoning a messenger required a ritual. "That's only one of the methods. That person got me to use another method." Fors glanced at her clothes and realized that her clothes were all wrinkled since she hadn't had the time to change her clothes last night. Upon realizing that she would be meeting the messenger later, she decided to pay attention to her image. She hurriedly returned to the bedroom on the second floor and changed into a beige dress with frilly designs. After preparing herself, she raised her right hand in front of Zio, and she grabbed at it as if she wanted to pull something out of the air. In her eyes, an illusory book took form. It quickly flipped and stopped at one of the pages. In the next second, her arm sank and a figure emerged from the void. This was Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a half-top hat and a black coat. He had a cold expression and an unyielding air, but his eyes appeared somewhat dull. I succeeded. This is just my second attempt. I've only tried it once yesterday and failed. Fors's eyes widened as though they wanted to take in more light so as to see more clearly. She knew that this was the historical void projection she had summoned, so she wasn't too nervous. Instead, she held her breath and looked warily at Gehrman Sparrow's projection. She couldn't tell if he was real or fake. She still remembered the combat achievements of this crazy adventurer. Fors has actually summoned Gehrman Sparrow. Shouldn't it be his messenger? Would Gehrman Sparrow still be able to summon something? Questions popped up in Zio's mind. Just as Fors was unsure of what to do next, Gehrman Sparrow's eyes darted around slightly as his gaze instantly turned focused. He no longer had a rigid and vacant look, as though he was alive. Following that, he took out an exquisite, silvery harmonica and blew it. No sound came out of it, but the surroundings instantly turned cold as a biting wind stirred. Then, a woman dressed in a dark and complicated long dress with 4 blonde hair and red eyes in her hands walked out of the void. Her 8 eyes looked at Gehrman Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow nodded slightly and pointed at Fors. This lady needs to set up 4 special coordinates deep in the spirit world. Please help her. Alright, one of the heads of Rionet Tinica said as it moved up and down. Gehrman Sparrow didn't speak further. As he approached the window, he made the glove on his left hand become transparent. His figure quickly disappeared as he teleported out of the house. He left just like that. The historical void projection I summoned left just like that. Fors stared with her mouth slightly open, as though she was experiencing a comical play. According to her understanding, the thing she summoned should be under her control. How could it leave after giving some instructions? Could it be that the historical void projection has the same personality as the actual person? No, it's as if Gehrman Sparrow himself had descended. Fors glanced at Zio and realized that she was just as confused as she was. At that moment, Fors suddenly shivered, as though an extremely terrifying creature was glaring at her. She subconsciously turned her head and realized that Gehrman Sparrow's messenger was looking at her with 8 red eyes, carefully observing her. As terrifying as Gehrman Sparrow. Fors forced a smile and said, "Sorry to trouble you." At this moment, Rionet Tinica's 4 blonde, red-eyed heads spoke one after another. Need to pay 800 gold coins. There's still a fee. Fors turned agape once again, at a loss for a response. After a few seconds, her thoughts suddenly became active as she began to calculate her savings. After loaning £2,400 to Zio, I still have £780 left. My expenses recently have been quite high, but the royalties from my past novels are still being credited. Adding my other income and the £300 Zio returned me, I have a total of £1,258. That's enough, Fors immediately agreed, but she immediately discovered a problem. Gold coins, all of them. Rionet Tinica's 4 heads shook slightly. Yes, you can. As expected, all of them need to be gold coins. I remember that Mr. World has been trying to gather gold coins and exchange for gold coins for quite some time before. It was to pay this messenger. The relationship between him and his messenger is really complicated. Mr. World should still have quite a few gold coins. I'll try to exchange 800 gold coins from him later. Fors secretly heaved a sigh of relief and said, "All right." After agreeing, Fors saw the headless messenger raise one of the heads in her hand to bite down on her clothes near her shoulder. The surrounding colors became saturated and brighter, the reds became redder, the blacks became blacker, and the whites became whiter. In such a manner, Fors was led by Rionet Tinica through similar scenes that she had no way of getting her bearings right. It didn't take long before she arrived at the spot where there was a faint fog. In the depths of the fog, one eye after another seemed to look over, but they quickly shrank back. When Fors summoned Gehrman Sparrow's projection from the historical void to Backland, he had immediately entered the fog of history and dashed all the way to a period before the First Epoch. His consciousness came alive within the projection, reducing Fors's spirituality expenditure. This way, Klein had indirectly returned to Backland. This was also the reason why he had gotten Miss Magician to use such a complicated method to summon the messenger. As for the messenger summoned by the adventurer's harmonica, it was an independent existence. It didn't increase the burden on Fors's spirituality burden. Even if the historical void projection vanished, Rionette Tineke could still remain in the real world if she so wished. After a teleportation, Klein's figure appeared in a secluded alley near St. Samuel Cathedral. He then used his faceless powers to change his appearance and figure. During this process, although there was still a few pedestrians in the alley, they were affected by an illusion. They didn't notice a sudden companion appearing beside them. Right on the heels of that, Klein straightened his clothes, pressed down on his hat, and walked quickly to St. Samuel Cathedral. He found a seat to the side of the main prayer hall and sat down. After taking off his hat and chanting an honorific name, he sincerely drew a crimson moon on his chest. Then, he clasped his hands together, closed his eyes, and prayed softly to the Evernite goddess. I'm currently searching for traces of the dark demonic wolf's past to grasp his exact condition. At this point, he recalled that the dark demonic wolf might have been a former colleague of the Evernite goddess. They likely knew plenty about each other, as he quickly added, I wonder if you can give me some hints. He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he maintained a calm attitude and continued, after this matter is completed, I plan on heading all the way east to see if I can reach the western continent and see what state that place is in. I'll take this opportunity to escape Amon's pursuit and find other possibilities. After praying, he tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion and whispered, Praise the Lady. Just as he finished speaking, a dark night sky with countless stars suddenly appeared in front of him. A message unknowingly appeared in his mind. It was information regarding Black Demonic Wolf, Kotar. Klein was stunned for a moment. Only when the starry sky before him completely disappeared did he return to his senses. He sincerely praised the goddess once again. After leaving St. Samuel Cathedral, he used Creeping Hunger and another teleportation to arrive near the Holy Wind Cathedral located in Sherwood Borough. He wanted to pray to the Lord of Storms. He looked up at the towering steeple and felt some momentary hesitation. He really wasn't sure if he should enter the headquarters of the Church of the Lord of Storms in Backland. I'm just a historical void projection. There's nothing to be afraid about. I won't suffer any losses from praying, but what if the Lord of Storms hears about the Amon situation and decides to bestow 0 to 32 to me? That way, I won't have to risk hunting the dark demonic wolf. A person should always be hopeful. After some thought, he finally made up his mind. He carefully raised his hand and summoned Enoni, the one who had yet to be parasitized by Amon, from the historical void to walk into the Holy Wind Cathedral in his own form. A minute or two later, a dark cloud suddenly appeared above Backland. There seemed to be a flash of silver lightning in the Holy Wind Cathedral, but no one noticed it. Report chapter. As soon as the dark clouds in the sky dispersed, everything in the Holy Wind Cathedral returned to normal. In a nearby corner, Klein raised his hand to rub his forehead. The corners of his mouth twitched as he mumbled, If you don't want to give it to me, so be it. But why did you kill my marionette? He then took a deep breath before his figure rapidly faded away and disappeared. The time limit for maintaining the historical void projection was almost over. After all, a scribe's imitation of a high-level power had significant differences from the original version. The burden of a sequence 6 summoning a sequence 3 was rather heavy. Even if a scholar of yore could transfer his consciousness over and reduce the spirituality expenditure, it was impossible for Fors to keep it up for too long. In the outskirts of Backland, downstream of the Tussock River, Leonard hid his red gloves and slowly walked towards a certain spot. Suddenly, the slightly aged voice of Palais Zoroast rang out in his mind, How's your former colleague been doing recently? Thinking back to the conversation at the Tarot Club, Leonard suppressed his voice and said, He just avoided a trap set up by Amon's avatar. He's searching for the truth in the forsaken land of the gods. After listening to what he had to say, Palais Zoroast didn't say another word and allowed Leonard to proceed forward. After setting up the special coordinates, Fors was thrown back into the real world by Gehrman Sparrow's messenger. I feel exhausted, but I just woke up not too long ago. It must be that high sequence beyond powers are too draining on my spirituality. Force covered her mouth and yawned. She looked at Zio with a haggard expression. That's possible. Zio agreed with her friend's judgment. Her intuition told her that the Gehrman Sparrow projection that had been summoned definitely wasn't simple. It could even be equivalent to a scent. After some hesitation, Zio said, "Sleep a little longer. Don't attempt to advance in such a state. In one of my previous trials, the murderer was mentally psychotic. He would deliberately make his friends, his students, and the tramps he took in, consume potions in all sorts of negative states, watch them lose control, and mutate into all kinds of monsters, disgusting and terrifying ones." What was this fellow's goal? Fawes was stunned for a second. 2 goals. One was to observe whether the same potion caused the same loss of control on different people. The other was to use oil paintings to record the corresponding scenes. He believed that the madness, the pain, and the distortion had an unparalleled beauty, one that can stimulate his greatest creative passion. Zio recalled the trial from back then. She felt a sense of hatred and lingering fear. He was a complete lunatic. That fellow should be executed. Force couldn't help but shudder when she imagined it. She bared her teeth and said, "Was he a cultist?" Perhaps, but there were no clues. On the surface, he appeared to be an outstanding artist, and he is very famous internationally. If it wasn't for more than 5 of his students and friends who had disappeared over the past few years, attracting our attention, then he might have had to wait until he completely went mad and lost control, becoming a monster, before this matter would be discovered. Zio suddenly paused for a moment before saying, "Back then, everyone in the law enforcement team that opened his hidden basement vomited. There were all kinds of mutated and terrifying corpses, and hanging overhead were all kinds of harrowing yet charming oil paintings. A hateful fellow, but it's also a very attractive story." Force thought for a moment and pressed, "Was he a devil?" "No, he's a psychiatrist." Zio rejected her friend's guess. "You sentenced him to death?" Force asked in anticipation. Zio shook her head. "His defense lawyer convinced me that he's more suited to be a sealed artifact researcher." "There's a lawyer? You have lawyers at the paranormal court. Isn't it all a direct trial?" Force asked in surprise. Zio straightened her blonde hair and said, "There are some beyonders from the lawyer pathway among us who also need to act. Of course, they don't know that they're acting." "All right." Force yawned again and pointed to the reclining chair beside the fireplace. "I'll sleep for a while." "Hey, don't you have work? We can take days off," Zio replied succinctly. Force didn't ask further as she walked to the fireplace and collapsed into it. About 2 to 3 hours later, she woke up and cogitated for 15 minutes. Following that, she found the Traveler Beyond a characteristic and the supplementary ingredients given to her by her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, and concocted a potion bottle. The potion's color was white but transparent. It was like half-melted snow water, occasionally producing light green bubbles. Force held the potion and glanced at her friend who was on guard by the side. She smiled and said, "If I lose control, don't hesitate. Just chop off my head. No, pray first. There might still be a chance to save me." Quote ellipsis quote. Zio slowly nodded. "Maintain this state." Force silently exhaled. Without any hesitation, she raised the bottle and gulped it down. In the blink of an eye, she felt her body and her eyes light up one after another. They blasted around her body and opened one illusory door after another. Force's consciousness couldn't help but enter one of them. Her entire body turned transparent as she vanished. In such a chaotic state of mind, Force nearly couldn't regain her sense of self-awareness. Thankfully, she had her fair share of being tormented recently and had a strong will. Furthermore, from time to time, she could feel the 4 special coordinates in the spirit world. Finally, she slowly came to her senses. After an unknown period of time, she realized that she had already entered the depths of the spirit world. It was difficult to tell her exact location, and she couldn't find her way back. With the help of the 4 special coordinates, Force slowly traversed back to a familiar spot, leaving the saturated, stacked colors and the thin fog before walking out of the spirit world. The 4 special coordinates weren't only used to help me find a way back, they can also effectively maintain my self-awareness. Teacher is only a sequence 7, so without any actual experience, it's inevitable for him to miss out on such knowledge. As Force thought, she cast her gaze towards Zio and smiled slightly. "I'm a traveler." Zio heaved a sigh of relief and asked curiously, "What new Beyonder powers did you get?" "The main one is teleportation. Also, invisible hand. In addition, the number of demigod-level Beyonder powers I can record has increased to 4. The actual effects should be close to that of a sequence 4. Fours examined herself. She then raised her hand and pulled out a tarot card from across the room, one used for divination. It was a person with a scepter in his right hand that pointed towards the sky. His left hand pointed to the earth. In front of him were people like the Holy Grail, a scepter, a sword, star coins, the magician card. Every year's longest night was the birthday of the Evernite goddess, commonly known as the Winter Gifts Day. On this day, all Evernite believers would head to a nearby cathedral to witness the sunset of the sun. When night fell, they would participate in Mass, enjoy a holy meal, listen to the hymns, and do all sorts of activities. The year 1350 for Lowan's Evernite believers was a very heavy year. The intensity of the war and the cost of items had made them lose the good mood they had. However, on Winter Gifts Day, they still came out of their houses. This was because the Church of Evernite was going to hold a massive Mass in the various large public squares to placate the souls that had passed away. At the same time, many foundations would distribute food vouchers at the Mass. People who received them could be able to obtain the corresponding items in any of the relief points or cathedrals. This led to Storm and Steam believers who didn't celebrate Winter Gifts Day to head for the nearest square. Westborough, Memorial Square, where George III was blasted to death. Dressed in a black cloak while walking her golden retriever, Susie, with a leather bag on her back, Audrey walked among the nobles looking refined. Her expression didn't seem abnormal, but she hid some pain and guilt. She had obtained the blood of an elderly mind dragon. After concocting the manipulator potion, she placed it in the small bag Susie was carrying. Susie was already a Sequence 6 hypnotist. She believed that not many people present would notice her abnormality and snatch things from her. The blood of the elderly mind dragon came from the hermit Catlear. Apparently, she had obtained it from Queen Mystic, and she had paid £3,000 for it. This was in line with her expectations, as she didn't really want to obtain the ingredients from the psychology alchemists. After all, her direct superior, Vin Rambus, had only died a few months ago. To collect the items needed for an advancement, it made it inevitable for people to suspect her. As for the other members of the psychology alchemists, they had the ability and intelligence to notice this point. Besides, after becoming a demigod, one has to come into contact with the psychology alchemists' counselors. According to Mr. World, there might be an angel from the mind domain hidden amongst them. I'll continue making preparations. With a suitable opportunity and excuse, I'll consider raising my position in the organization. I'll hide my strength for now. The blonde Audrey lifted the ends of her skirt slightly and slowly walked towards her predetermined spot. Along the way, many nobles extended their hands to her in a friendly manner, hoping to help this beautiful, noble, and weak young lady through the crowd. However, these were all blocked by Earl Hall. He got his eldest son, Hibbert, to be in charge of his youngest daughter while he held his wife's arm and walked ahead. From time to time, he would turn back to look at the most dazzling jewel of Backland. Not long after their family arrived at the destination, the Church of Evernite's Bishop of the Backland Diocese, St. Anthony Stevens, walked up to the high platform in his black robe with red patterns. He looked around, raised his right hand, and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. Praise the Lady. When the believers below responded, this saint's deep voice could be heard by everyone. Today is the celebration of the night, but the goddess's response is pity. She takes pity on every mother who has lost her child. She takes pity on every lonely child. And she takes pity on everyone who has suffered immense pain. She said that all of this will end. All the suffering will return to silence and repose. As Anthony Stephen Vincent's words echoed in Memorial Square, it spread to other areas. The Lowanese citizens who participated in the Mass were both moved and sad, feeling warmth in the midst of the depression. In a different square, different choirs began to chant the hymns. The ethereal and holy voice seemed to echo deep in everyone's heart. Full-faced above the land stood the crimson moon, and sweet it was to dream of themselves, of child, and wife, and parents, but evermore, one. Unknowingly, everyone felt their spirits being cleansed and their spirituality naturally released. They seemed to have entered a dream and were strolling in a quiet darkness. Their children were sleeping here. Their parents, their wives, their husbands, their friends, and the deceased were no longer suffering. They no longer had any pain, their expressions were peaceful and gentle. We look upward into the night sky, we tenderly say her name, Evernite Goddess. If she heard us, she would surely agree, smiling with purity at the dead. Come, rest and sleep well, my children, too. The people who were strolling in the dream felt awash with intense sorrow once again, as though they realized that they were really going to bid each other farewell. They recalled all the beautiful memories from the past. They recalled the scene of their family enjoying delicacies and having fun at the dining table. They recalled the people who looked at them warmly, and the pain of seeing them get hurt. When they learned of their passing, it was as if they could tear their souls apart. They recalled the dark clouds and separation that had been brought to this war. They were sleeping peacefully in this serene nation, no longer having any worries. However, the people who survived had to suffer the days and nights, turning haggard and withered. One teardrop after another flowed down. The people participating in mass at Memorial Square could no longer suppress their emotions as they silently released the pain they had accumulated. A huge wave of sadness filled the air, mixed with the chanting of the choir, as though it had a corporeal form. Cross your hands humbly, over your breast. Make the silent prayer, and shout from the bottom of your heart, the only escape is tranquility. 3. The people who were sobbing silently with their eyes closed subconsciously followed the content of the hymns and made similar gestures. Then, they shouted in their hearts, infected with each other's emotions, the only escape is tranquility. The grief reached an apex with more than 10,000 hearts resonating at Memorial Square. At this moment, Audrey opened her eyes and bent down. She took out a bottle of potion from the leather pouch that her golden retriever, Susie, was carrying. There were countless points of light floating in the potion, just like the manifestation of the sea of collective subconscious. Audrey didn't hesitate. Under such circumstances, she removed the bottle cap and gulped down the liquid inside. Unlike in the past where she could experience the potion slush through her throat and into her stomach, she immediately felt abnormal. She felt that she could no longer sense her body. Her entire being seemed to have condensed into an idea as she merged into the illusory sea around her. This was her first time directly seeing the sea of collective subconscious without passing through a dream or mind island. As though she had returned to her mother's embrace before she was born, she returned to the very beginning where the imprints left by human ancestors were washed away by the tides as they crumbled and were influenced. There was fear, madness, and all kinds of terrifying mental corruption. For a moment, Audrey found it difficult to resist. Her consciousness faded, and her body shook as though it was on the brink of melting away. However, the sea nearby wasn't serene. There was a certain degree of undulations, spreading the intense sorrow and pain around. Under such influence, the self-aware Audrey, who was about to be assimilated by the sea of collective subconscious, also began to resonate, generating uncontrollable feelings of grief within her. The grief spread from one thought to another. Soon, it filled the blob of thoughts that Audrey had mutated into. It pierced through her soul body and pierced her soul. Audrey finally regained a little of her senses. She skillfully placated herself, constantly giving cues to remove the corruption until she regained her senses. The voice in her ears became clearer and clearer, louder and louder. Finally, it reverberated through the sea of collective subconscious. The only escape is tranquility. The only escape is tranquility. The only escape is tranquility. Audrey repeated the prayer as her figure quickly turned clear. With a mere thought, she split herself into many transparent and illusory bodies. She traveled through the sea of collective subconscious and reached the mind islands that represented different people and stepped onto them. In these places, she could clearly see the sadness coming from different people. The bombshells that came from the sky, the airship that made up a fleet, the letters spelling bad news sent from the front lines, blood and flesh splattering in front of them, and the person who they loved suddenly collapsing in front of them, the pile of toys that no longer had an owner, the fit of coughs that came from the great smog. The only escape is tranquility. The golden retriever, Susie, also shut her eyes in mass. She used the human language to recite those words in her heart, but she failed to notice any changes in her surroundings. Suddenly, in her soul, in her body of heart and mind, Audrey's voice sounded, "Susie, I succeeded. I've always been worried that I'll become more and more indifferent as my sequence increases due to the potion's effects, that I'll become more and more like a mythical creature instead of a human." Susie raised her head in confusion and saw that although the blonde girl's eyes were tightly shut, tears had unknowingly covered her face. Then, she heard Audrey say in her heart, "Thankfully, I can still feel their sorrow." How nice. In Susie's eyes, teardrops fell from the corner of the blonde girl's eyes. It was crystal clear. At this moment, the sun's final ray of light was swallowed. The night brought about tranquility. Everyone opened their eyes and said in a calm voice, "The only escape is tranquility." After crying without restraint, the bright, cheerful Audrey's mood became heavy. She became a little sensitive and a little sad. It made everyone who saw her feel a sense of love from the bottom of their hearts. Under all kinds of protection, she returned to Empress Borough and returned to her room. Only then did she have the chance to seriously examine herself and digest the knowledge and experience she gained from the sea of collective subconscious. Others might not be able to tell, but Audrey knew very well that the tall, blonde, blue-eyed beauty in the mirror already possessed extraordinary strength and exaggerated dragon-scale defenses. She could break through a block of steel with one punch. Oh, I can still use dragon transformation. It's equivalent to using an incomplete mythical creature form. However, I have to wait until I get used to the potion and keep stacking up the correct psychological cues. Otherwise, I can lose control. Every dragon transformation can't exceed a certain amount of time. Otherwise, even if I have the means to treat my mind and soul, I'll be contaminated by madness and confusion, causing me to lose control. My current limit is about a minute. The core power of a manipulator is manipulation. I can allow a body of heart and mind pass through the sea of collective subconscious and enter another person's mind island. I can directly change their subconscious and read their thoughts, silently driving them to do all sorts of things. Matching manipulation is virtual persona. I can create many personas, allowing them to have a corresponding body of heart and mind. This aspect can resist a lot of influence in the mind domain, and on the other hand, it can allow me to use them to silently invade the target's island of consciousness without any signs of it. I currently can have only 13 virtual personas. A manipulator can also create a terrifying mental plague. By using the sea of collective subconscious, I can spread all kinds of mental illnesses and extreme madness. Yes, or has turned into mind deprivation, a huge area of effect version. It's no longer just the single effect of, or, I can also transform my designated thoughts into a mind storm that will sweep the surroundings, affecting all my enemies. Hey, as a manipulator, it naturally comes with the ability to travel the sea of collective subconscious. It's called consciousness stroll. Otherwise my target would have long left by the time I arrived at a location after a series of complicated manipulations. Audrey looked at herself in the mirror and suddenly revealed a faint smile. Then, she puffed up her cheeks and opened her mouth as if she was about to spew something. Since her mythical creature form was a mind dragon, it definitely had to have some form of dragon's breath. This was an attack that could directly stimulate and harm the target's body of heart and mind and soul body. It dealt damage in an area of effect manner, an upgraded version of psychic piercing. Following that, Audrey's green eyes turned slightly and she looked away. She sighed inwardly. This is what it means to be a demigod. These powers make even me feel afraid. How powerful is Mr. World for him to be able to kill Vin Rambus? In the ancient palace above the fog. As the participants of the hunting operation made the preparations, they decided to organize a private gathering to discuss the details. A manipulator is that terrifying. The magician Fours looked at Miss Justice beside her and blurted out in shock. Just now, Audrey had briefly mentioned the changes she had undergone after becoming a demigod. Although she didn't elaborate in detail to protect her trump cards, it still left the magician, the hermit, Judgment, and the star in shock. Actually, it's not that terrifying. Mr. World knows very well. Audrey cast her gaze to the bottom of the long, mottled table. The World Gairman Sparrow didn't nod as he tersely acknowledged. I also had powerful helpers before I could kill Vin Rambus. He paused and said, before discussing the hunting operation, I would like to know how to make the Abraham family sense my friendliness. Friendliness? Upon hearing the World Gairman Sparrow's question, Fours nearly doubted her ears. The image of Mr. X's head that was put together, leaving it covered in cracks, crevices, and blood surfaced in her mind. Just as Fours was deliberating over her words, Audrey glanced at her and smiled at the World Gairman Sparrow. To let the Abraham family sense your friendliness, it isn't about what you do, but what Miss Magician writes in her letters. That's right, unless I appear directly in front of Miss Magician's teacher, his understanding of me will only be limited to the various rumors and things that Miss Magician tells him. As long as the story she tells is good enough, even if it doesn't fit the actual situation, it doesn't matter. Klein suddenly realized that he had been splitting hairs on the question. Fours was somewhat enlightened by Miss Justice's words, but she didn't fully understand it. After looking at the hermit, the star, and company, Justice Audrey said to Fours, you need to convey Mr. World's friendliness to your teacher. For this, you can fabricate some stories and not tell him the truth. Then what should I say? Foles asked for advice. This wasn't because she wasn't good at making up stories. On the contrary, this was what she was most adept at. However, the problem was that writing a novel that was well received was different from a story that could convince people. If she could get a senior psychologist's advice on the latter, it would undoubtedly be easier. Audrey had already thought of the details of the letter before she opened her mouth. She replied unhurriedly, "It's obvious that your teacher has already noticed that you've rapidly advanced, and because of Mr. X's death and all sorts of sensitive issues, he has a certain level of doubt and vigilance regarding the Beyonder circles that you've participated in." Yes. Foles nodded indiscernibly in agreement with Miss Audrey's judgment. If her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, was careless, he wouldn't have been able to survive to this day. He would have long been caught by the Aurora Order or died in the hands of other powers who were interested in the Abraham family. Audrey continued, "In such a situation, he will still maintain contact with you. He will teach you knowledge, give you formulas, and provide you with ingredients. This shows that, on the one hand, he acknowledges your character and morals, and on the other hand, he will also have a certain level of anticipation for you to obtain important information from the mysterious and dangerous Beyonder Circle, as well as you becoming a Sequence 4 demigod. This is the mentality we want to exploit." Audrey originally wanted to use the more neutral term, grasp, instead of exploit, but after pausing for a moment, she chose to face herself directly and face the essence of the matter. With Foles listening attentively in judgment, the star, and the hermit looking forward to what she had left to say, Audrey pursed her lips and said, "When you return, you can write to him and tell him that you have already become a traveler. It will make him happy for your growth, and also be surprised by such an exaggerated advancement speed. Then, you can answer the question he asked previously, saying that the gentleman who was seeking to purchase the Worm of Star had mentioned something, that the ancient curse in the Abraham family seems to come from a secret existence known as Mr. Door. This is a question that your teacher has never told you about but is definitely concerned about. Without a doubt, he will feel fear towards the gentleman who seems to know that you're related to the Abraham family. He will want to avoid you, but he will definitely yearn to know more. He will then try to find out what secret lies behind the curse that has plagued generations of Abrahams, one that he has no solution to. At the same time, a letter exchange isn't a direct meeting. It will give him a certain sense of security. He might change his residence, change his identity, and use a more roundabout way to receive the letter, but there is a high chance that he will not sever the connection. Maintain this connection. Step by step, reveal something more valuable. You will awaken your teacher's desire and use it to portray an image of Mr. World so that your teacher can experience some form of friendliness." At this point, Audrey stopped and looked at the World Gairman Sparrow once again. She could roughly tell that Mr. World's goodwill towards the Abraham family was because he had a request, but as for the specific request, she wasn't a clairvoyant, nor had she read Gairman Sparrow's mind. Naturally, she couldn't guess it, nor could she continue explaining. Klein nodded and said with a hoarse smile, "After we establish this kind of indirect connection, I might ask your teacher for a transaction and use the promise of breaking the curse to exchange for certain items of value." Through Demoness Trissy, he had already grasped the solution to the Abraham family's curse. However, he didn't plan on exchanging it for the Planeswalker potion formula or a Grade 0 sealed artifact. On the one hand, the difference in value was too great, making him feel guilty. On the other hand, he didn't want to bring a dangerous existence like Mr. Door back into the real world. It was being irresponsible to himself and the innocent. He was thinking of another way to make the curse of the Abraham family disappear to a certain extent. In other words, it might still exist, but it wouldn't affect the normal lives of the Abraham family and provide a certain range of improvements. Is that so? Mid to high sequence Beyonders in the mind domain are really impressive. She can make people follow her arrangements without realizing it. Compared to when we first met, Miss Justice has seemed to undergo a complete metamorphosis. It makes people fear and respect her. Foles glanced at Zio and seemed to read the same poignant thoughts from her eyes. After some thought, she mustered her courage and said to the World Gairman Sparrow, "What if my teacher rejects your request? Did you think I would murder for property?" Klein lampooned in Chinese. He scoffed and said, "Don't worry, I won't harm him. I won't use any methods that will force him. Phew. Although Mr. World is a little scary, he's still a man of his word." Foles slowly nodded and said, "I'll write a letter to my teacher according to Miss Justice's suggestion." Klein nodded slightly and surveyed the area. You can begin discussing the hunt. Katlia took control and said, the biggest problem with this operation is finding the Saint of Secrets Botus. Fors immediately recalled how she had encountered him and raised her hand. If I can borrow that powerful sealed artifact from my teacher, then I can bring it with me. I can often wander around Backland and use the convergence of Beyonder characteristics to attract Botus to a nearby location. This might attract other demigods of the apprentice pathway, or the leader of the secret order, Zaratul, or blasphemer Aemon. The more Fors spoke, the lower her voice became. She felt that this method was too dangerous. She didn't know what would happen to the other members who participated in the operation if Zaratul and Aemon really appeared, but as bait, it was without a doubt that she would fail to escape. Katlia nodded and said thoughtfully, if it's only a grade 1 sealed artifact of the apprentice pathway, the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics shouldn't be that attractive to neighboring pathways. The range will be limited to the demigods of the apprentice pathway. And from what I know, there aren't many of them. In fact, it can be said that there are very few of them. Most of them exist in the form of a characteristic or sealed artifact. I suddenly do not wish to become a sequence 4. Fors's eyelids twitched when she heard that. Katlia cast her gaze at the World Gehrman Sparrow. Let's not discuss the problem of whether there are any grade 1 sealed artifacts of the apprentice pathway. If we want to let the Saint of Secrets and Miss Magician bump into each other, the prerequisite is that he is also in Backland. He mustn't be that cautious and often goes out. Upon hearing this, Leonard said from the angle of a professional official Beyonder, it's actually not difficult. As a demigod of the apprentice pathway, Botus is definitely in charge of dealing with accidents among the upper echelons of the Aurora Order. He has sufficient mobility to aid the other members in different places. Hey, this is a term that appeared after the steam engine and the airship were invented. As long as you can create some matters against the Aurora Order in Backland, he has a high chance of showing up. As he spoke, Leonard glanced at Klein. Based on what he knew, in the chaotic battle outside Biome City caused by Gehrman Sparrow, the Saint of Secrets had appeared and picked up a glove. This is a solution. Audrey and company nodded. At this moment, the world suddenly said, let me remind you that the Aurora Order is an organization that worships a true god. Once you take action against them and secretly target their upper echelons, the true creator might be able to foresee this and give them a warning. That can happen. Audrey's eyes widened slightly as she observed Katlia, Leonard, and company. She realized that they were equally astonished. This was something that they had never considered before. It wasn't that they weren't smart enough, but that they had never participated in such matters that involved high-level existences before. Or rather, even if they were involved, they weren't aware of it. Then what should we do? Fors couldn't help but ask. Klein replied in a suggestive tone, by not targeting the Aurora Order directly, we can use a milder approach to fish out the Saint of Secrets Botus. A milder approach. The hermit Katlia, who lacked experience only on high-level matters, instantly had a new idea and probed, let Miss Magician participate in the various Beyonder gatherings in Backland. Accidentally, revealing that she's related to the Abraham family, attracting the attention of the Aurora Order. Seeing no objection from the World Gehrman Sparrow, Katlia thought as she looked to the other side. How we can make this matter appear reasonable without arousing suspicion, how to design the steps and procedures needed to expose herself, and how to lay the foundations at each one of the gatherings, these might require your help, Miss Justice. From her point of view, only a manipulator who could accurately grasp the various mentalities of the different people at the gathering could allow the scheme to appear natural and reasonable, without leaving a trace. All right. Audrey nodded solemnly, feeling somewhat excited. She then added, although I've never done anything similar before, I will try my best to make everything seem reasonable. Why do I suddenly feel a little afraid? Why do I feel like we are all inexperienced people? Apart from Mr. World who can't directly participate, Ma'am Hermit might be very experienced in other aspects, but she shouldn't have been involved in such hunting before. This isn't a game, it's a cruel act that can kill someone if we aren't careful. Fors trembled when she heard this. She had a deep suspicion of the experience of most of the members. This included herself. However, when she thought of how Miss Justice and Ma'am Hermit were already Sequence 4 demigods, and that she and the Star were at Sequence 5, she felt that this wasn't too serious of a problem. After all, every powerhouse had accumulated their experiences over time from nothing. Furthermore, they still had the World Gehrman Sparrow, the strongest hunter over the 5 seas. Reasonable. Scheme. Manipulation. Listening to the conversation between Ma'am Hermit and Miss Justice, Klein subconsciously extracted the keywords. This reminded him of how he had used 008 and the experience of playing out situations that had been arranged by 008. He couldn't help but sigh inwardly. It's no wonder the Spectator's Sequence 1 is called Author. This is indeed a very reasonable development, but it can change from a guidance to being forced. There's no need to rush yourself to make the arrangements in detail. Go back and think it over carefully. Yes, at the same time, we need to combine the feedback from the scene to make adjustments. Katlia nodded in thought as she immediately had a new idea. When Miss Magician participates in the Beyonder gatherings, it's best you hide in the vicinity. Use your control of the sea of collective subconscious to monitor every participant's thoughts and accurately grasp the feedback. Would 13 virtual personas be enough? There should be more than 13 members at a Beyonder gathering. I can switch to using monitoring to select a target to focus on. Audrey quickly analyzed the feasibility of the suggestion and tersely acknowledged. That wouldn't be an issue. To her, this was also a form of training. At the same time, it was also a form of acting. She didn't directly use her Beyonder powers to affect the target, but instead used her precise understanding of the target's mental state to manipulate them by using words, behavior, actions, and a script. Seeing that there was no problem on Miss Justice's side, the hermit Katlia looked at the magician. In order to prevent a surprise attack, and to better grasp your surroundings, I need to plant something on you. What is it? Foles asked warily. Katlia glanced at the world at the bottom end of the long, mottled table. After receiving the permission of Mr. Fool's Blessed, she raised her hand and pressed it between her brows. A pair of transparent eyes appeared in front of her, ones that were without eyelashes, looking cold and heartless. This is the eye of mystery prying. After becoming a mysticologist, I can place it on someone else's body. Whatever it sees, it will be what I see. Furthermore, once it enters a concealed state, it will be very difficult to be discovered through other means. Katlia gave a simple introduction. Upon seeing this scene, Klein leaned back slightly and sighed inwardly. When he first grasped spirit vision, he had seen something similar behind old Neil. If he had the mysticism knowledge he had now back then, he would have detected the problem earlier. Perhaps things would have developed differently. If this strange eye were to be planted on me, wouldn't I be watched by Ma'am Hermit when I go to the bathroom? Foles secretly drew a cold gasp as she hesitantly asked, can we plant it before each gathering? If we make frequent contact with each other, we'll be easily discovered. Besides, the Saint of Secrets wouldn't only appear at times you choose. Katlia nudged the heavy glasses on her nose bridge and explained. Don't worry, I won't look at things I shouldn't see. It was a lesson learned through blood. Foles fell silent for a few seconds before she slowly exhaled. All right then. Katlia nodded slightly and continued, after discovering clues to the Abraham family, the Aurora Order will definitely do a certain amount of investigation. And for safety, so as to prevent any accidents from happening, they will definitely send out someone with a certain level of confidence. Among them, the Saint of Secrets Botus is undoubtedly the person who is most interested in the matter regarding the Abraham family. In addition, Backland isn't suitable for a King of Angels main body to be active in, so the probability of him appearing is the highest. At this moment, the star Leonard, who was leaning against the back of his chair, raised his hand and said, not necessarily. According to the information we have gathered, the Aurora Order has other high-ranking members in Backland, St. Tenebris. After Mr. A disappeared, he came forward to organize certain matters. When the time comes, the person responsible for tracking the clues to the Abraham family might very well be him, not the Saint of Secrets. After all, this is his diocese. The demigod I met when I assassinated Mr. X was Saint Tenebris. Klein nodded in enlightenment without bringing any attention to himself. Katlia was already prepared for this. Without any hesitation, she said to the star, this might require your help. In the near future, you should investigate more cases involving the Aurora Order and strike at them more. This way, it will be inconvenient for them to move around. After discovering clues about the Abraham family, they might very likely seek reinforcements, getting, yes, the more mobile and more concealed Saint of Secrets to be responsible for it. Leonard thought of his recent mission list and nodded slightly. Sure, as the captain of a Red Gloves team, he had the right to do so. The only problem is, could this be predicted by the true creator? After Leonard agreed, he turned to look at Klein. After some thought, Klein pointed out indirectly. You are similarly under the gaze of a deity. Leonard retracted his gaze as though he had gained some understanding. He said to the hermit Katlia, I have no further questions. The hermit Katlia raised her glasses and cast her gaze towards judgment. We will try our best to limit the Beyonder circles that Miss Magician will be involved in to Eastborough and the Backland Bridge area. These should be places you are familiar with. You have to constantly be aware of any abnormalities. Inform me immediately about the surroundings of the gathering's location. All right. Although Zio was disappointed that she was involved in the periphery matters, she knew very well that with her strength, she could only do so much. At that moment, Katlia thought for a moment before saying, "You are a judge. When the time comes, you might need to do some area of effect, prohibition. This might not be effective against the Saint of Secrets, Botus, but it should be able to cause some interference. Don't doubt it. As support, mid-sequence Beyonders can similarly influence a Saint to a certain extent. All of this is under the premise of a demigod resisting a demigod, while all I provide is support." The education Zio had received since she was young, and the addition of the knowledge she learned from MI9 now put an emphasis on cooperation. It was very easy to understand what Ma'am Hermit was saying. At this point, the plan had just started taking form. The next step was to adjust it bit by bit through on-the-ground feedback. Force heaved a sigh of relief when she suddenly thought of something. She hurriedly said, "Previously, Mr. World mentioned that Botus might have a Grade 0 sealed artifact. How should we deal with it?" Frankly speaking, she didn't have a direct impression of how terrifying a Grade 0 sealed artifact was. This was because she had never encountered one before and had never seen anyone encounter it before. However, she had experienced the Grade 1 sealed artifacts that Gaemon Sparrow had borrowed from Mr. Fool. She knew how terrifying it was, and with a Grade 0 sealed artifact being one grade higher than a Grade 1 sealed artifact, it was obvious how potent one was. In the rumors that Fours had heard, some Grade 0 sealed artifacts could even destroy Backland, or even the world. Katlia said after a few seconds of silence, "On the one hand, through Miss Justice's grasp of the minds of the people around you, she will be able to find traces of possible existences. On the other hand, with Miss Judgment's understanding of the various anomalies in the region, and combining it with divination, we will be able to determine ahead of time if there are any sealed artifacts. If we can't get any feedback from all of this, and if the Saint of Secrets has a Grade 0 sealed artifact with him, you don't have to be too afraid. He won't kill you immediately. He will definitely try to gain control of you and interrogate you at a safe place. We have enough time and opportunities to separate him from the sealed artifact. Remember, a sealed artifact that a Beyonder possesses isn't completely a part of his strength. During this process, didn't you record some high-level Beyonder powers? If the situation is critical, don't hold back, and try your best to escape. Sounds like you're not very confident either." Force's face suddenly turned pale as she forced a smile. "I'll try my best." At this moment, the World Gaemon Sparrow took the initiative to speak. "In times of necessity, pray to Mr. Fool. I will also ask him to provide his protection in advance and provide some revelations. As this operation wouldn't pose a threat to Klein's actual body regardless of the development, and it might involve a Grade 0 sealed artifact, he could only gain some revelations from his initial control of Sephira Castle." "That's good." Fours, Zio, and company heaved a sigh of relief. When the private gathering was coming to an end, Klein glanced at Katlia and said, "It looks like there's no way to end the operation before New Year. I'll provide you with the advance payment." He then condensed some of mysticism knowledge he had never mentioned into a pale white brilliance and pushed it to the hermit. Dark Angel Sasria might very well be the negative personality that's expelled from the ancient sun god. Mr. Dor was once the most powerful king of angels. The Abraham family also possesses at least 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts that's at the level of an angel of the apprentice pathway. The underlying rules of this world are chaos and madness. Pieces of mysticism knowledge resonated in Katlia's mind, causing her to feel weighed down in addition to her shock. If it wasn't for the Tarot Club, Mr. Fool's protection, and the World Gaemon Sparrow's help, she believed that it wouldn't be easy for her to obtain such knowledge. She definitely had to take a tremendous risk in exchange. If she wasn't careful, she would attract the attention of certain high-level existences, or be embroiled in madness and pain. "Thank you for your advance payment. This will greatly help me digest the potion." Katlia opened her eyes and thanked him sincerely. According to her original plan, she believed that she would be able to gain some mysticism knowledge after meeting Queen Mystic. With Gaemon Sparrow's current advance payment, her mysticologist potion would most likely be completely digested. Unfortunately, a few days before she arrived in Backland, Queen Mystic Bernadette had left the city to trace a lead. This left Katlia extremely disappointed. Upon hearing Ma'am Hermit's words, Klein, who was pretending to be the world, laughed hoarsely. A price is exacted for what's bestowed. As his voice echoed, he nodded at the two ladies, Justice and the magician, indicating that he was also directing those words at them. After the private gathering ended and the members left Sephira Castle one by one, Klein stood up and walked back to the seat of honor from the bottom end of the long, mottled table, to the seat belonging to the fool. He leaned back into his chair and propped his elbow on the armrest as the void beside him rippled and formed halos. These were prayer lights that came from puppets controlled by a historical projection that Klein had summoned. They had existed before the gathering, but the corresponding area had been hidden from the rest, so no one could sense it. It was only now restored to normal. He cast his gaze at the rippling light and expanded his vision into the distance. In the real world, a dark mountain stood erect. There was a mountain hole at the mountainside that extended downwards. This was once a place that hid many humans who had survived the cataclysm, but they were later turned into dark demonic wolf Katar's marionettes. During this period of time, Klein kept tracing the clues and found 3 spots where the dark demonic wolf had hidden himself. However, Klein didn't gain much from them. The reason was simple. Just like now, there was a rock in the cave. On it sat a young man wearing a classic black robe, a pointed hat, a broad forehead, and a thin face, Aemon. This angel of time seemed to sense the gaze from Sephira Castle as he raised his head and adjusted his crystal monocle. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Klein retracted his gaze, his facial muscles twitching slightly as he muttered, "What a haunting presence. It's not like this fellow doesn't understand the dark demonic wolf's past. Is there a need for him to destroy all the clues I need? Furthermore, he only comes slightly earlier than me every single time. If it wasn't because he wasn't Aemon's match, he really wanted to hang him up and beat him." Phew. Klein exhaled and immediately returned to the real world. He wore a black top hat and carried a dim yellow lantern. He dispelled his maintaining of the historical projection and, without looking back, he left the mountain and ventured deep into the silent wilderness. There was no hesitation in his footsteps, as he had already obtained detailed information about the dark demonic wolf, Kotar, from the Evernite goddess. He was well aware of the character, styles, and habits of the god of wishes. The reason why he was still searching for the dark demonic wolf's past was mainly because he wanted to verify the information. After all, the East Continent had been in the forsaken land of the gods for more than 2,000 years. The dark demonic wolf had escaped the Evernite goddess's attention for a sufficiently long period of time, so it was very likely that some abnormalities and changes in character would occur. If he made a plan following the intelligence provided by the Evernite goddess, there was a small chance that he would make the mistake of launching a surgical strike using an outdated map. Under the tremendous pressure from the true creator and Aemon, the chances of the dark demonic wolf transforming isn't low. Perhaps it has even turned abnormal or half-mad because of the excess stress. Klein couldn't help but lampoon inwardly. The words, dark demonic wolf, could actually be switched to, Klein Moretti, or, Joe Mingrui, ad verbatim. It just needed to be said in future tense. The other reason for his persistence in pursuing the dark demonic wolf's past was that he was trying to fool Aemon, making it difficult for him to guess that he had already grasped the key information. Of course, this might not be able to deceive the god of deceit. His main goal was to obtain a victory of the mind, so as to adjust his mental state that was overly stressed. This allowed him to reduce the frequency at which he sought Miss Justice's treatment. Well, from the looks of it, the dark demonic wolf still maintains its clarity and rationality in the late Second Epoch. It wasn't as violent as when it first fused with other Beyonder characteristics, bloodthirsty, crazy. His most important personality appears to not have changed, ever so suspicious. He doesn't even trust his own marionettes. Once he decides to migrate, he would leave all the marionettes that he had before and sever all connections. Also, the dark demonic wolf seems to have migrated from the east over here. As he thought about it, Klein came to an abrupt stop. Under the darkness that was void of stars and the crimson moon, he cast his gaze in a particular direction by relying on his spiritual intuition. His expression gradually turned solemn as he raised his right hand and pressed on his silk top hat. Then, he adjusted the direction he was heading in and walked towards where his eyes were trained at. That was the east. In the endless darkness, the lantern in his hand cast a lonely shadow. His trench coat was almost the same color as the distant night as his footsteps quickened. Backland, Empress Borough, inside the Hall family's luxurious mansion. Audrey sat in front of the dressing table and began to seriously consider how to release the bait, in a seemingly reasonable fashion. During this process, she suddenly thought of something. That was that, if she wanted to go nearer beyond a gathering and monitor the thoughts of the participants, there was a lack of quick and efficient methods. As a Sequence 4 demigod, she neither could fly nor teleport. She also couldn't use the flames to jump secretly. It would be fine if it was late at night, but if she wanted to use dreams as a springboard, she could only rely on her feet during the day and evening. Oh, actually, my speed isn't slow, but if I were to run faster than a steam train, I would definitely attract attention. There are so many powerhouses in Backland, so there's no lack of existences that can see through my psychological invisibility. Similarly, in my dragon form, I can fly, but that's just too eye-catching. Currently, I can only let my consciousness and spirit body enter the sea of collective subconscious, while I'm unable to bring my body in. As she pondered about the matter, Audrey could only consider purchasing sealed artifacts or mystical items that had traveling powers while deciding to travel through dreams if there were dreams. Otherwise, she could only rely on walking, carriages, or the metro. What a simple demigod. It's no wonder the full name is half human, half god. Those terrifying beyonder powers are the godly side of things, while these are the human side of things. Audrey gave a self-deprecating laugh and reined in her thoughts. Backland, Hillston Borough. Sitting beside the fireplace, Fors opened a book that was propped on her thigh as a platform for her to write. Holding a pen in her hand, she stared at the horizontal lines on the paper and the tarot cards that were scattered on the ground for a long time. What's wrong? You don't want to lie to your teacher. No, everything you write will be the truth. You don't want to set up your teacher. Zio walked over, crouched down, and looked up into Fors's eyes. Fors shook her head. No, it's not because of this. I do feel a little guilty, but I know that this is a good thing for the Abraham family. I'm just hesitating. I keep feeling that our destinies will change after writing this letter. Zio was a little stunned when she heard that. She didn't quite understand what her good friend meant. Fors let out a sigh and said, the battles from the past and now were actually not that dangerous for us. We had the ability to avoid it and obtain the corresponding resources to continue our peaceful lives. Therefore, my feelings for them don't run deep. We're like people standing beside a torrent. We could have watched everything go by safely, but after writing this letter, we might perhaps be swept into the torrent. Zio listened quietly. She opened her mouth and pursed her lips. If not for this, do you think we can avoid the torrent of fate? As she spoke, she picked up a tarot card from the ground. The surface of the card depicted an angel blowing a trumpet and the deceased. Judgment card. Fors looked at the deck of tarot cards for a while before closing her eyes. She pulled her hair back and smiled. I understand. This is an inevitable destiny. After praying to Mr. Fool and after obtaining the magician card, it was an unavoidable destiny. The fountain pen in Fors's hand finally landed on the letter. Fritz Harbor. Dorian Gray Abraham, who had long left the Fishermen's Association and changed his identity, tore open the letter sent by his student. As he quickly browsed through it, his expression went from shock, joy, and confusion to horror. Bang! Dorian threw away the letter in his hand and knocked down the table in front of him. It was like a monster hiding on that piece of paper with a curse. He retreated to another corner, pulled open the drawer, and took out some items. Then, he rushed to the door and prepared to leave. When his right hand touched the brass doorknob, Dorian's actions suddenly slowed down and finally stopped. He slowly turned around and cast his gaze at the letter on the ground. There was a complicated look in his eyes. After a few seconds, Dorian Gray Abraham slowly walked towards the letter. He walked with hesitation, feeling the dilemma and struggles, but he didn't stop. It was as if he had been seduced by the devil. Finally, Dorian stopped beside the letter. He bent down and reached out his right hand. His fingers trembled as he grabbed the edge of the paper and picked it up. This time, Dorian was very careful. He began reading each word, one after another from the very beginning. Sometimes he was enlightened, sometimes confused, sometimes puzzled, and sometimes in pain. The letter Fors had sent wasn't long. He only used 3 minutes to read it twice before he fell into a long silence. The sunlight shined through the window and landed on the toppled table. Dorian Gray Abraham's lip suddenly quivered, but he ultimately didn't make a sound. Separated by a piece of paper, his right thumb and index finger quickly rubbed against each other and ignited the letter with a scarlet flame. After doing all of this, Dorian packed his belongings, put on his disguise, changed his clothes, and left the rented apartment. Using the identity he had previously prepared, he went to another place. After settling down, he sat beside the desk and stared at the brass ornament, seemingly deep in thought. The area became darker and darker as the sunlight weakened. Dorian's eyelids twitched as he slowly sighed. He then unfolded the piece of paper and picked up the fountain pen. As he pondered, he wrote, "I'm very happy to see you digesting the scribe potion in a few months. This means that you might really become a demigod. These are the key points to take note of while acting as a traveler, at least the ones that I know of. However, you have to remember that everyone's personality is different. There will always be some differences in acting in real life, so you can't copy blindly. This doesn't mean that the acting principles of others are wrong, but that it might lead to a huge conflict in your heart, affecting your mental state. Sometimes, you can make appropriate adjustments to slow down the speed at which the potion is being digested, but it will only be beneficial to you. You have to remember, acting is a tool, not something to lord over you. I look forward to the day you completely digest the traveler potion. I will prepare the corresponding ingredients and a present for you. I'm very interested in the matter of the Abraham family's curse mentioned by that gentleman. I think you should have noticed long ago that I have done a certain degree of research on such matters. Otherwise, you wouldn't always ask me about such matters. I hope you can continue to learn about this matter at a deeper level." After writing the reply, Dorian Gray Abraham closed his eyes and quickly folded the paper. January 1351, Backland's new year was much bleaker than before. In a basement in Westborough, there were a few candles flickering with yellow flames, illuminating the surrounding altars, chairs, and round tables. At the edge of the light, in a place that was extremely dark, a figure appeared indistinct. At times, it would sway, sometimes stretching into a thin entity that didn't have any thickness. It was like a shadow that came alive. Suddenly, the figure said in a deep voice, "You arrived earlier than I expected." Beside the candle, a figure quickly appeared in the spot illuminated the greatest by the light. It was a man dressed in a mysterious black robe. His brown hair was slightly curled, and his dark, deep eyes seemed to contain countless objects. He was none other than one of the 5 saints of the Aurora Order, the Saint of Secrets, Botus. Botus smiled and said, "To me, distance is not a problem." He pulled a chair and sat down before saying to the long and narrow shadow, "Have you investigated thoroughly? Did you find anything unusual?" The shadow that nearly slinked into the shadows answered in a low voice, "There aren't any problems." Really? At the confirmation of the question, Botus instinctively had doubts. Kisma, could this be a trap? The Aurora Order's Saint Tenebris, Kisma, slowly shook his head and said, "The target is very careful. It's definitely not a case of deliberate exposure. If she wasn't seeking to purchase an ancient wraith's cursed item, we wouldn't have been able to sense that she might be related to the Abraham family." Saint of Secrets Botus seemed to be in thought as he said, "An ancient wraith's cursed item. This is one of the main ingredients of scribe. I remember that the Abraham family does have a spare Asmon's brain. Hey, they aren't willing to directly provide a scribe beyond a characteristic, hoping to carry out some tests. It's indeed the style of the Abraham family. To put it simply, they don't have enough trust in others." Saint Tenebris Kisma didn't echo Botus's words as he continued, "Even if she was seeking to purchase the main ingredients of the scribe potion, we wouldn't have noticed any problems. After all, not every believer knows the corresponding mysticism knowledge, but she even mentioned some questions related to Apprentice and the Abrahams. She was really cautious in this aspect. The circle of beyonders from which she sought to purchase materials from and the one she asked questions weren't the same. Different matters were left to different circles. Furthermore, at times, she would hire other participants to help her make requests. If it weren't for the fact that we have our people in those few circles and were able to combine the intelligence, we wouldn't have noticed her." Saint of Secrets Botus nodded slightly and asked, "Why didn't you just take action? You even came to me." In the shadows, the darkness stirred and replied slowly, "The situation in Backland is getting more and more tense. The Nighthawks, the mandated punishers, and the machinery hive mind are carpet sweeping the area, one spot after another. We're being watched very closely. If I were to handle this matter, it would be fine if there weren't any accidents. However, if an accident were to happen, I might not be able to escape due to not having grazed a secret sorcerer. Besides, aren't you the one who is most interested in the Abraham family?" Botis chuckled and said, "I'm not interested in them at all. I just want them to all die. To ensure my own safety, the most important thing is to nip revenge in the bud. This is the philosophy I abide by." As he spoke, the Saint of Secrets took out a crystal ball from his black robe's pocket. The crystal ball was neither clear nor translucent, as if it had been injected with the dark night. As he touched it with his palm, his lips quivered. This strange crystal ball suffused a resplendent glow. They were like stars that slowly spun, forming a complicated scene. "It's still acceptable." Botis looked at the crystal ball in his right hand and nodded gently. He then looked at the ghostly shadow. "Give me the details." When he learned that there would be a Beyonder gathering in a particular circle tonight, with the target possibly appearing, the Saint of Secrets Botis stood up and said to Saint Tenebris Kisma, "I need to make some preparations." As soon as he finished speaking, his right hand opened and with a gentle lift, his fingers closed. The region he was in immediately warped and vanished. The candles, flames, round table, and chairs that were originally located here vanished, leaving behind only the tiles and ceiling. After a while, the shadows moved and everything returned to normal. Nothing happened to Saint of Secrets Botis, but Saint Tenebris's figure appeared out of the darkness. He looked at Botis and said in a deep voice, "Your caution has exceeded the necessary limits. But this isn't a bad thing. I hope that I can resolve the problem without anyone noticing," Botis replied with a smile. "You can follow me. You can hide in the shadows as my support. You will not directly appear, and you will leave immediately once you discover anything amiss." "All right." Saint Tenebris Kisma slowly walked out of the shadows. He looked young and handsome with outstanding facial features, but his face seemed to be covered with a faint curtain of darkness. After coming close to Botis, there were a series of illusory chewing sounds that came from nowhere. The chewing sounds and the sound of digesting could be heard, as well as undisguised evil and hunger. This made the demigod shudder involuntarily. Saint Tenebris's eyes froze for a second as he cast a shocked and surprised look at Botis's face. The corners of Botis's mouth curled up as he revealed a rather cruel smile. A few seconds later, one of them used teleportation, and the other merged into the shadows and left the house. In an apartment that had been in disrepair for years, in the area intersecting Backlands East Borough and the Bridge area, there were a few rooms on the first floor of a cheap motel that had their rooms connected. When Botis walked out from the spirit world, the Beyonder gathering was only to be held 2 to 3 hours later. No one had arrived yet. He looked around and took in the long tables that were arranged messily. After observing the environment, he walked to a corner with his right hand pulling the curtain. The region was then enveloped by a shadow, distorting before vanishing. This was because there wasn't anything there to begin with. There was no objective measure, so no one would have discovered that there was a space missing. They would only feel that the distance between the walls and themselves was a little closer, but upon closer inspection, everything was normal. This was the space concealment power of a secret sorcerer. They could use this ability to split a place into two and conceal part of it. One had to use a specific door to enter. At that moment, in the area that had been divided and hidden, the room existed normally. There were floor tiles, a ceiling, and a cockroach crawling across the ground. The cockroach rushed to the boundary and was blocked by the endless darkness. After Saint of Secrets Botis surveyed the area, his gaze paused at a transparent vortex in midair. This was the door. Every hidden space would definitely have a door. After some thought, Botis reached into the black robe's pocket, took out a mirror, and inserted it into the door. The mirror twisted and quickly reflected the scene in the outside world. There were chairs and long tables randomly strewn around. The place was empty. In this way, Botis used this mirror to monitor the Beyonder gatherings venue. Seconds changed to minutes as the Beyonders dressed in various disguises arrived. One of the hooded figures habitually chose a corner near the window. She took out a palm-sized notebook and casually flipped through a few pages, as though she was revising the main points of her questions or checking if she was fully prepared. And behind her to the side, there was an ordinary mirror embedded in the wall. In the region that had been concealed, the Saint of Secrets, Botis, narrowed his eyes slightly as he recognized Leymano's travels. This made him no longer have any doubts about the intel provided by Saint Tenebris Kisma. He recognized this notebook and knew that it was a mystical item that the Abraham family placed great importance on. It was one of the most powerful items below the high sequences, and the negative effects were negligible. Hey, back when I was a mid-sequence Beyonder, I had yearned for this notebook so much. In the end, the Abraham family was wary of me and didn't place any importance on my needs at all. Now, have they learned their lesson? This woman shouldn't be a descendant of the Abraham family. Otherwise, she wouldn't have gone around searching for the cursed item of an ancient wraith. Botus muttered inwardly as his expression gradually turned grim, showing hints of a cruel fervor. After observing his surroundings for a while, he carefully reached into his black robe's pocket. The pocket seemed to contain a vast space as Saint of Secrets Botus dragged out a 3-layered jewelry box from within. This jewelry box wasn't tiny, making it difficult to hold it with one hand. It was mainly silver-black in color, and its surface was covered with exquisite decorations. There were rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and diamonds embedded in it, making it look rather luxurious. As he held the jewelry box in his hands, there was a hint of panic and fear in his expression. It was as if he was facing the abyss or listening to an evil god's ravings. Ellipsis. The gathering continued as usual. Foles put away Leymano's travels and focused on listening to the participants, as though she was seeking some answers. During this process, she would occasionally ask questions, using gold pounds and spiritual materials as payment. However, she didn't receive any effective answers. Gradually, the Beyonder gathering came to an end. The host arranged for the different participants to leave from different exits. Soon, only Foles and a few other Beyonders were left in the room. After receiving the signal of the host, Foles stood up and resisted the urge to stretch herself as she walked towards the side door. At this moment, she realized that her body had stiffened. Her head could barely turn, but it felt like she was a toy that had its torsion spring wound up. From the corner of her eye, she saw that the grayish-white walls had turned silvery black in an instant. They were covered in granules, as though they were made of metal. The remaining participants and the host had their skin lose the luster that it should have possessed. Their eyes were dull, their movements mechanical, as though they were large dolls. In the concealed area, Botus had opened the jewelry box at some point in time. The interior of its top layer wasn't exquisite enough, but it had completely restored the scene of the room. In the room, there were chairs and long tables scattered haphazardly. There were a few palm-sized puppets sitting or standing, as though they were trying to simulate reality. Among these people, the person standing was wearing a hooded robe. The shape of her chin was beautiful and her lips were plump and red. It was none other than Foles. She and the remaining Beyonders, together with the gathering's host, had silently become toys. They had been taken into the highest layer of the jewelry box. The room that connected in the external world was only left with grayish-white walls, nothing else. The corners of Botus's lips curled up bit by bit. With his right hand, he closed the lid of the jewelry box. In just a single breath, he had magically controlled his target. This silver-black, 3-layered, jewelry box, was the Grade 0 sealed artifact that he had snatched from the Abraham family. As it had never been obtained by the Orthodox churches, nor was it ever deeply understood, it didn't have a corresponding number. According to what Botus knew, this jewelry box originated from an Abraham family angel from the 4th epoch. He enjoyed roaming the cosmos and heading to different places in the vast universe. However, once, when he returned to his family to rest, he died silently in his palace. His face was filled with fear, and his expression was twisted as if he had seen something extremely terrifying. A true mythical creature, one that could be considered a subsidiary god in the 2nd epoch, had actually died silently without causing a stir. The death was extremely bizarre. The Beyonder characteristic he left behind combined with his corpse, forming the jewelry box, that was quite different from the other kind of sealed artifacts. And back then, Mr. Dor, Bethel Abraham, not only didn't attempt to shatter it and restore it to a pure Beyonder characteristic, he had even given it a rather strange name, Box of the Great Old Ones. The first level of the Box of the Great Old Ones could turn the target's location into toys and switch locations with its interior. Botus had used this trait to easily achieve his goal. The second level of the Box of the Great Old Ones recorded different locations. Once it was released, the holder and the living beings within its effective range would head directly to the corresponding region. They would then wander around the cosmos like the angel from the Abraham family back then, exploring the universe. As for what was on the third level of the Box of the Great Old Ones, Botus knew about it but didn't dare to think about it. It was just like how he usually didn't dare come into contact with this Grade Zero sealed artifact. Smack. After closing the lid of the box of the Great Old Ones, he grabbed the mirror that was embedded in the transparent vortex that was suspended in midair with his right hand. Once a certain area was concealed, a secret sorcerer had to use the corresponding door, or directly remove the concealment, to exit. Botus had chosen the latter method because it was the easiest and fastest method. The shadows stirred, and the area that disappeared returned to the real world. The room was finally complete. Botus didn't stay any longer. Without even looking at his surroundings, he made his body rapidly fade away. He held the many-gemmed, silver-black box of the Great Old Ones as the colors saturated and overlapped with each other. He traversed the spirit world, which was filled with strange creatures, towards his designated location. In a few seconds, he walked out of the void, attempting to enter the ruins of the Battle of the Gods by crossing the huge chasm that split the seas. At this moment, the Botus stopped in midair. His eyes narrowed and his eyes instantly turned dark, dotted with countless points of resplendence. It was like the cosmos had been reflected in his eyes. The gravel, formed by the stars, spun rapidly, causing the cracks at the bottom of the sea to rapidly turn incorporeal, causing everything in front of him to shrink and condense into a wavering orange flame. This flame extended from the tip of a matchstick as it was extinguished. Everything that Botus had experienced after removing the concealed space was an illusion. He remained rooted to the ground. And the source of this illusion was the burning matchstick. The matchstick was held by a fair-skinned palm, and the owner of the hand was a woman wearing a purple-patterned black robe and a hood. She was sitting on a carriage that was halfway through the wall, formed from a gigantic pumpkin. Pulling the carriage were a bunch of grey rats. This was none other than Katlia, but her appearance, image, and bearing had changed. This was the power she gained from the magic of Cinderella. The core beyond a power of the Mystery Prior Pathways sequence for Mysticologist was called mystical reenactment, fully expressing the saying, knowledge is power. To put it simply, a mysticologist could draw power from different mysticism knowledge they grasped, and create all sorts of magic or witchcraft. As for the corresponding mysticism knowledge, the less that was known by others and the less it spread, the more powerful the spells became. The contrary could also be established. Once some knowledge and legends were known to many and no longer mysterious, the magic or witchcraft created by drawing on its powers would become almost ineffective. Katlia had no idea why the queen could create all kinds of magical powers that were rich in magical colors from the private fairy tales that Emperor Roselle had told her, but that didn't hinder her learning and usage of them. After all, she had heard of those fairy tales from Queen Mystic. The magic she had used it to temporarily transform and disguise herself was called Cinderella. The magic that threw Saint of Secrets Botus into an illusion was the Little Match Girl. With that, she had used it to stop the other party from teleporting away, creating an opportunity for the battle that would follow. Just as Botus had extricated himself from the hallucination, the Cinderella, who was sitting in the pumpkin carriage, placed her foot on the ground and spread out her arms, causing a huge cross to appear behind her. As for Katlia, she seemed to be carrying an illusory object. In the empty room, candlelights lit up, one after another, illuminating a long table covered with flesh and blood. Around the long table were three extremely blurry figures holding the globs of flesh as they constantly devoured the food. As if sensing something, the three figures turned their heads at the same time and looked at Botus. This Saint of Secrets' heart raced as he felt a chill rush out from deep within his soul. He then heard illusory gnawing, chewing, and digesting sounds. He could feel the undisguised malice and hunger. Botus's eyelid twitched. He hurriedly lowered his head and cast his gaze at the box of the Great Old Ones in his hand. The silver-black box had opened itself without him realizing it at some point in time. The magic that Katlia used was called the Feast of Betrayal. It stemmed from the mysticism knowledge she learned of the ancient sun god's death from the Tarot Club. Its purpose was to temporarily awaken or imbue the target with intelligence, allowing them to commit a betrayal. Without a doubt, the effects of encountering a sealed artifact that was filled with malice towards the owner would be excellent. However, if not for the fact that she had obtained the protection of Mr. Fool at every gathering they monitored, Katlia wouldn't have dared to use this magic. Once the three main leads of the betrayal feast sensed it, she would definitely die for obscure reasons. She wouldn't be able to resist her death and would die an abnormally horrifying death. Therefore, mysticologists were definitely individuals with high risk. Their strength came from walking the edge of the abyss, coming from things they shouldn't have seen or heard. In comparison, Queen Mystic, who could create magic from her father's private fairy tales, was much safer than other mysticologists at the same tier. When opening the first level of the box of the Great Old Ones, the long table, chairs, fours, and the others were like dolls. They were either still or motionless. Otherwise, under the power of torsion springs, they made repeated simple movements. Upon seeing this scene, Bottas's hair stood on end. For some baffling reason, he felt that he was about to join and become one of them. He instinctively wanted to react to the Grade Zero sealed artifact in his hand, but he saw the hooded, purple-robed woman retract her right hand and hold it to her mouth, slightly clenched. A dark color instantly formed in her palm. It was an ancient bugle with a charm that appeared very heavy and powerful. The Horn of Magic, the Horn of Destruction. Bottas's pupils dilated as he lacked the luxury of time to deal with the box of the Great Old Ones. He grabbed forward with his right hand, as though he had raised an invisible screen that shielded the void. The area he was in was distorted once again. He disappeared and was concealed. Woo! The horn in Catlia's hand let out a soft hum. It echoed in the room but didn't extend out of its confines. With the sound waves overlapping, the shadows shattered and the ground cracked. The space that had been concealed by the Saint of Secrets was like a thick piece of glass that had been struck by a sledgehammer. Countless cracks appeared and intertwined with each other. Elsewhere, a towering knight in full black armor appeared out of the shadows. He held a long broadsword, and two dark red beams of light glimmered in his eye sockets. Saint Tenebris Schisma. Woo! Once again, Catlia blew the horn. Everything in the room seemed to freeze into a translucent amber. Silently, the amber broke apart, and even the black armored knight fell to the ground like a mirror, shattering into small shards. The distorted region returned to the real world. However, Bottas also managed to grab the gaps between the two horn blows as he created numerous illusory doors to appear around them. Some of them were double doors that opened outwards, some were deep and recessed, some were covered in mysterious patterns, and some were hollow in the middle, allowing one to vaguely see the boundless darkness behind them. The illusory doors were in bountiful numbers, densely packed, and overlapped together, almost enveloping the Saint of Secrets. Without any time to think further, Bottas immediately opened a grayish-blue door with 7 brass locks, and he threw the box of the Great Old Ones that was just about to have its second layer open inside. This was a secret sorcerer's exile. It could throw a target that he had gained initial control of into a corresponding chaotic space. As for the different illusory doors, they represented different scenes, ones where danger and opportunity coexisted. This kind of exile wasn't permanent. At Bottas's sequence level, he was only capable of isolating the box of the Great Old Ones from reality for 20 seconds. Once that time was up, the Grade Zero sealed artifact would return to the spot beside him through the illusory door from before. However, by then, the betrayal induced by the enemy's Beyonder powers would definitely have disappeared. As a demigod of the apprentice pathway, he had traveled many places, witnessed many things, and recorded many kinds of powers. Bottas made the most correct decision in that split instant. At the same time, the Black Knight that had split into pieces quickly squirmed and reformed, becoming a thin rug that flowed with flesh and blood. It covered every corner of the room. As a cult that could only survive in the shadows of reality, the Aurora Order might have many lunatics, but they were used to doing things to conceal themselves so as to prevent themselves from attracting the official Beyonders before the goals were met. Of course, once the matter was in its final stages, they would definitely proclaim their existence openly. In addition, Saint Tenebris Schisma had done so in hopes of obstructing the possible enemies that were hiding outside to a certain extent. This allowed a separation of the battlefield. When a layer of flesh grew out from the floor, walls, and ceiling, a twisted black shadow rose up from the corner. This was one of the souls that Saint Tenebris Schisma had grazed. It was a powerful vampire from the Forsaken Land of the Gods, a Sequence 4 Shaman King of the Moon Pathway. If the shepherd's grazed target was a demigod, he could release it directly due to the existence of its corporeal spirit body. However, there only one could be released at any one point in time unless the corresponding shepherd had already become a Sequence 3 Trinity Templar. Seizing the opportunity that the horn in the female demigod's hand was dissipating, the twisted Shaman King reached out and dug out one of his eyes, a bright red, illusory eye. The eye shimmered with a bright, crimson glow as it instantly illuminated the entire room, as though the crimson moon had descended. Its pupil reflected the woman wearing the purple-patterned black robe and a dark-colored hood. Immediately following that, the Shaman King clasped the hand which was holding his eye, letting the crimson, moonlight, become completely devoured by darkness. A deep darkness appeared around Katlia as the solidified darkness bound her to the spot. It froze the scene. Upon seeing this scene, Botus took a step forward, phasing behind his enemy instantaneously. Performing one blink, followed by another as a total of 8 figures dressed in black robes appeared around Katlia. These weren't avatars he created, but afterimages he left behind due to his blazing blink. Some of them released lightning storm, while others condensed a blinding white spear. Some were covered in black armor as they slashed out a heavy broadsword that could appear capable of slicing through anything. Different figures with different powers either attacked or created a form of control, but their target was one and the same, Katlia. There was almost no pause in between their actions. When Botus's figure blinked to another corner, he quickly turned transparent as he was on the brink of disappearing. He had no intention of killing the enemy, as this was Backland. Also, the commotion created from their battle couldn't be suppressed any further. Once it affected the outside world, official angels might descend. The reason why he had first launched a series of counterattacks before teleporting away was because he wanted to suppress the enemy and prevent her from interfering with his and Saint Tenebris Kisma's escape. This was a very reasonable strategy. However, a few seconds ago, in a room on an upper level of the old apartment, Zio had learned of all the changes in the venue through Miss Justice's mind voice. Although she was worried and anxious, she didn't panic at all. She followed the plan and jumped down from the window, somersaulting in midair as she pointed at the targeted area. Teleportation is prohibited here. After doing this, she immediately distanced herself from the apartment to prevent the friendly demigods from being distracted. With this interference, the Saint of Secrets, Botus, failed to successfully enter the spirit world. A rusty, abnormally heavy door appeared in front of him as it tightly sealed the path. To Botus, an illusory door of this level wasn't able to stop him from leaving at all. He could open the door once he made some adjustments. But at this moment, something anomalous had happened over at the female demigod in the purple-patterned black robe. Silver light appeared in Katlia's eyes. They connected together like a mysterious giant snake. This was brief luck, derived from the knowledge she had obtained when analyzing the blood of a snake of fate. Regardless of the terrifying lightning, burning white spear, or the slash of the Black Knight, none of them hit the target. Katlia seemed to be standing at the eye of the storm. No matter how dangerous the surroundings were, she was unaffected. Those attacks and the attempts at control either narrowly passed her by or were cancelled out by friendly forces. They were unable to achieve the desired effect, and they even helped her weaken the dark shackles. Instantly, Katlia bowed her back slightly as white and illusory feathers grew out of them. They didn't belong to an angel, but rather, a swan. The ugly duckling had become a swan. As for what a swan was, to a Sequence 4 demigod, the answer was obvious. It was an incomplete mythical creature form. And the ugly duckling could also become a swan. This was a powerful magic that could allow a mysticologist to reveal their incomplete mythical creature form once a day, with each instance lasting 10 seconds. The surface of Katlia's body immediately cracked open as flesh and blood gathered inside, forming eyeballs with clear blacks and whites. The countless eyeballs coldly scanned their surroundings, as though they were manifestations of multifarious knowledge. As such, the figure that bore their weight turned into a black blob that was even more abstract in a higher spatial dimension. Upon seeing the densely packed eyeballs, Saint of Secrets Botus and Saint Tenebris Kisma felt dizzy. A knowledge storm took form in their minds. The layer of flesh and blood that enveloped the entire room began to tremble slightly. Some dripped down, while others squirmed intermittently. At this moment, an unimaginable aura pierced through the barrier formed from flesh and blood, pouring into the first floor of the dilapidated apartment and enveloping every corner of the apartment. At the same time, Saint of Secrets Botus and Saint Tenebris Kisma were shocked. Their bodies, souls, and minds were in an uncontrollable state. This was dragon might, which had undergone a qualitative change, mind deprivation. Seizing this opportunity, the black blob that was covered in cracks and eyes condensed a spear in front of it. The spear appeared ancient in style. From the tip to the handle, it was dyed in blobs of blood-red splotches. It emitted a mighty destructive aura and a bloody feeling, as though it had once hurt a mighty existence. With a whoosh, the terrifying spear shot out, heading straight for the Botus who stood rooted to the ground. In the entire room, all the voices and details vanished. Even the dragon might that filled the room suddenly disappeared, leaving behind only the bloody spear tip and Botus's body, as well as the constantly shrinking distance between them. Sphere of Longinus. The blood-stained spear that seemed to come from an ancient time that couldn't be traced had absorbed the entire room's presence, stabbing straight into the body of Saint of Secrets Botus. The brown-haired, firm-bodied Botus's figure faded away, turning into a pair of black double doors. At the same time, he appeared behind the door, placing himself in a separate world from the terrifying spear as he looked at it from afar. In the next moment, the spear that was stained with red blood pierced through the black door and bore into the space where Botus was. Botus's figure kept retreating, constantly transforming into one illusory door after another. Some of them were made up of two winding stone golems, while others had a fist-sized hole by the gaps of the door. Some were embedded with silver nails, while others were covered in mysterious patterns. One after another, they were layered repeatedly, extending to an infinite number. Without a sound, the spear of Longinus tore through the illusory doors without stopping at all. It didn't allow Saint of Secrets Botus to find a chance to escape. In less than a second, the blood-stained spear that emitted a strong sense of destruction had shattered countless illusory doors. After it suffered a decline in its aura, it finally stabbed into its target's chest. Countless cracks instantly appeared on Botus's body, as if he was a ceramic object that had fallen to the ground. With a cracking sound, the Saint of Secrets turned pitch black as he disintegrated into pieces, scattering all over the ground. This didn't seem like his actual body, but more like his shadow. This was the shadow substitute spell he had recorded from a certain sequence 3 sent under the True Creator. Of course, without the layers of doors weakening the spear of Longinus, he believed that it was very likely that his shadow together with his body would have shattered together. After narrowly dodging this strike, Botus endured the dizziness and shock brought about by Catlia's incomplete mythical creature form as he made a gigantic, scaleless silver snake appear in his eyes. This gigantic snake was so large that it filled Botus's eyes. Its surface was filled with dense patterns and labels formed by one mystical wheel after another. Its head connected to its tail as it merged with countless illusory rivers, turning into a blurred, surreal, and slowly spinning gear. Around the round gear were all sorts of symbols that represented different futures. Suddenly, the black fragments that had yet to disappear on the ground flew up one after another and reorganized themselves on the spot, restoring Botus. The ground that was stained with dark red blood quickly retreated from the numerous illusory doors until it returned to the distorted black blob. The strong, fearful atmosphere receded like the tide and left the room. The black blob, that was covered in cracks and eyeballs, squirmed and restored itself, turning back into a purple-patterned black-robed woman with a hood. Everything returned to the point before the ugly duckling magic was used. Reboot of Fate. This was one of the rewards given to Saint of Secrets Botus for crushing the Abraham family. He was allowed to record the sequence 1 beyond a power from the Angel of Fate, Ouroboros. Of course, there was definitely a huge gap from the original version. It could only reboot reality for 3 seconds, and it was limited to the space of a tiny room like this. It wasn't even able to affect the entire first floor of the apartment. The moment reboot ended, the prepared Saint Tenebris Kisma immediately took action. The Grey's twisted shadow that stemmed from a sanguine count spread open its arms and made a gesture of embracing the crimson moon. The darkness around Catlia surged, instantly forming illusory but firm black chains that bound her to her spot. The flesh and blood that covered the ground, walls and ceiling gathered together rapidly, turning into a knight covered in black full-body armor. He held a heavy great sword in his hand and looked extremely oppressive. In the gap of the black knight's visor, 2 dark red beams of light flickered and instantly locked onto the hooded woman beside the pumpkin carriage. The shadow beneath Catlia's feet suddenly came alive as it grabbed her ankles. Like a water current that had its water level rising, it gripped her tightly. Black Knight, commandeering shadows. Then, the gigantic knight that was almost reaching the ceiling as though he came from mythical legends rushed to a spot not far from his target with a single step. He cleaved down with the heavy, long broadsword. Elsewhere, a silver illusory book in the eyes of Saint of Secrets Botus flipped rapidly. It then stopped at a single page. With that, Botus reached out his left hand and grabbed the pumpkin carriage across a distance of 20 to 30 meters. He then grabbed at the mysterious woman in a purple-patterned black robe. His arm suddenly grew longer, and its surface was black and sticky, as if it was flowing with an evil liquid. Amidst the liquid, pale skulls and eyes with pronounced blood vessels grew out, including sharp teeth and tongues. All sorts of strange things grew out, causing extreme evil and extreme madness to spread rapidly through the area. In the room, the ground instantly cracked and the few cockroaches that were still alive collapsed to the ground. This was an attack from a particular state of abomination sewer. Back outside Byam City, Saint of Secrets Botus had been attracted by Tinder. It appeared as though he only watched from the sidelines for a while before picking up the item and leaving immediately. But in fact, he had been desperately trying to record the powers or states of the high-level existences. After failing numerous times, due to the frequent blessings of fate, he eventually obtained what he wanted. Of course, during that battle, he only managed to record one. Under this evil and pitch-black arm, Katlia's consciousness was tainted with madness. For a moment, she was unable to respond effectively. Together with the shackles of darkness restraining her shadow, she could only stand rooted to the ground as she watched Saint Tenebris Kisma's great sword slash at her while Saint of Secrets Botus reached out his left hand to grab at her. At this moment, the flesh and blood walls in the room that separated the interior from the exterior was gone. An invisible and abrupt wind stirred up. The moment the wind appeared, it grew violent and swept towards the Saint of Secrets's and Saint Tenebris's hearts. Manipulator, mind storm. Not only was he not surprised or flustered by the chaotic thoughts, Botus even had the corners of his lips pull up as he smiled. As the switch for the reboot, he naturally remembered that the demigod riding the pumpkin carriage had a helper of the same level hiding outside the apartment somewhere. The reason why he placed his focus on the enemy on the surface was to lure out the hidden demigod. In between the two powers of reboot of fate and the abomination state, Botus had secretly hypnotized himself, allowing himself to naturally divide the burden of mind deprivation and the knowledge torrent across most of his worms of star. He then left a small number to control his body so as to lock onto the hidden enemy. Previously, the dragon's might shock, and the fact that he was unable to discover his target, had convinced Botus that it was a demigod of the spectator pathway. While his mind was in a daze, the thing he branched out rapidly churned and helped Botus locate the source of the attack. But at this moment, most of the thoughts that resonated among the worms of Star wasn't him being overloaded with meaningless information as he had imagined. In his mind, there seemed to be a voice saying thousands of words in a second. At the bottom of an abandoned castle in Delaire Forest, there is a pair of bronze double doors. It seals with the corruptive forces underground. The higher the sequence of Beyonder is when approaching, the easier it is to be affected. The cosmos is extremely dangerous. There are unknown existences watching. Dark Angel is suspected to be the negative personality dissociated from the ancient sun god. What? Botus was taken aback. He felt that these thoughts were dangerous, but he couldn't help but wish to understand more. Just this moment of stupor made the enemy he had already found disappear once again, escaping his range of attention. As for the abomination palm that was hurtling towards the pumpkin carriage and the female demigod, it also slowed down. Similarly, Saint Tenebris Kisma was also affected by the mind storm, as his actions stiffened for a second. By the time they recovered, Katlia had already opened her mouth and spat out a pea. The pea instantly grew, turning into thick green vines that dragged Katlia out the door, allowing her to escape the shackles of darkness and regain some freedom of movement. By the time Saint Tenebris's heavy great sword and Saint of Secrets's pitch-black arms landed on her, they only shattered a shadow and did not injure this mysticologist. They had shattered Katlia's, Emperor's new clothes, magic, something that didn't exist at all, so she naturally wouldn't be injured. In the next second, the hooded lady in the purple-patterned black robe suddenly turned transparent and turned into a pile of foam. The bubbles quickly scattered and burst one after another. Nothing was left behind. As for the green vines, they grew into midair and burst into flames, illuminating the surrounding streets. Everything returned to normal. It was as if the short and intense demigod-level battle had never happened. Saint of Secrets Botus and Saint Tenebris Kisma exchanged glances. They weren't surprised by such a development. Clearly, after the sneak attack failed, the two demigod enemies were at a disadvantage and could no longer achieve the goals. Furthermore, this was Backland. The longer they delayed, the more dangerous it would be. Hence, they took the opportunity to escape. In addition, in order to interfere with the tracking, they had deliberately created a huge commotion to attract the authorities of Backland. As for the copy of Leymano's Travels and a sequence 7 or 6 Apprentice Beyonder, they were baits that could be abandoned. After a slight nod, Saint of Secrets Botus took out a crystal ball from his black robe's concealed pocket. It bloomed with light before it quickly shattered and merged into the void. He was trying to prevent tracking via mysticism means. Indeed, he didn't dare to stay any longer. He planned on teleporting away and returning to the Aurora Order headquarters. Then, he would interrogate the bait and figure out the truth before deciding what to do next. A second later, Bottas's figure quickly turned transparent and disappeared. Kizma entered the shadows and rapidly left, wiping the traces behind him along the way. The Saint of Secrets, Bottas, began to traverse the spirit world the moment he entered, heading straight for the easternmost front of the Sonya Sea, the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. At this moment, his thoughts blurred. His body turned and left the spirit world through another place. By the time Bottas received a warning from his spirituality and had regained control of his own thoughts while feeling tense, what he saw was a bare forest with nearly all its leaves scattered. There was no one around, and the crimson moon hung high in the sky. As a former traveler and astrologer, he immediately identified his location and found that he was still in Backland. However, he had moved from the city to a remote area in the suburbs. At the same time, he also understood what had happened. It was unknown when his mind world had been infiltrated with someone else's consciousness. At the critical moment, it affected his thoughts and changed his destination. That spectator pathway's demigod. I didn't realize it. Bottas's pupils dilated as a silvery white illusory book appeared. The book flipped to one of the pages. Bottas immediately raised his hand to grab at his glabella. He grabbed a ball of darkness from the island of consciousness and threw it into his shadow. His shadow was separated from him as it twisted to a stand, revealing a female silhouette. Black Night, Shadow of Deprivation. This was an ability that Bottas had recorded from Saint Tenebris Kizma. It could separate one's depraved thoughts into a shadow and form an uncontrollable independent creature. Bottas used it to erase the consciousness that didn't belong to him, and escape the influence of the manipulator. At the same time, this was also Bottas's counterattack. As long as the hidden spectator pathway demigod couldn't quickly resolve this shadow, the thoughts she had fractured would gradually become independent, turning her half mad and even causing her to lose control. Once he was done with the latent mental problems, Bottas didn't hesitate to escape the enemy's predetermined battlefield and teleport elsewhere. However, at this moment, his mind suddenly turned frantic. He felt that the entire environment was making things difficult for him, and his anger could no longer be contained. As the silver book flipped in front of his eyes, the entire forest collapsed with a loud bang. The black shadow almost collapsed into a ball. After his bout of mania, Bottas's mood dropped to a nadir. He couldn't lift his spirits with regards to anything. He felt that he was useless, a burden to others and even the world. Mental plague. In the previous battle, Bottas had already been infected by mental plague, and it had finally acted up. The reason why Katlia first used the little match girl magic wasn't only because she wanted to interfere with Bottas's teleportation, but also because she was helping Miss Justice conceal any traces, allowing her virtual persona to infiltrate Bottas's mind world without triggering his spiritual intuition. A seed of mental plague was planted secretly without triggering it. It was precisely because of this that when the sneak attack failed, Katlia and Audrey dared to initiate the contingency plan. They retreated on their own accord, allowing Saint of Secrets Bottas and Saint Tenebris Kizma to separate from each other after they were out of danger. Katlia's final igniting of the final green vine appeared to create a huge commotion to attract the attention of the official Beyonders, making the enemy abandon their pursuit, but in fact, it was to force the Saint of Secrets to leave as quickly as possible. This way, he didn't have the time to carefully examine and check his condition at a deeper level. Hence, at the critical moment of his teleportation, he had his thoughts changed by Audrey's virtual persona. He came directly to the outskirts of Backland, an uninhabited kill box which the Tarot Club had chosen. And once he finished off the manipulator's virtual persona, the eruption of mental plague came right on the heels of that. In fact, if he had used Reboot of Fate earlier, he definitely would have been able to return to a state where there were no latent problems. However, he only decided to use this trump card when he was nearly killed by the Spear of Longinus. And by that time, his mind world had already been infiltrated for far more than 3 seconds. He was dispirited and depressed, trying his best to resist his mental illness. It was at this moment that he saw a bunch of surreal yarn balls appear out of the void in front of him. At the back of the yarn ball, the bright-colored yarn extended into an infinite distance. Following this line, Katlia, who was wearing a purple-patterned black robe and a dark-colored hood, walked over from the spirit world and appeared in front of the Saint of Secrets, Bottas. She was unable to track down enemies that had done some level of interference, but she could establish a connection with the predetermined battlefield. She could trace Justice Audrey's virtual persona. The moment she arrived, Katlia closed her eyes and formed a phantom image that fell towards an invisible coffin. The already depressed Botis instantly felt extremely exhausted. He couldn't help but close his eyes, wanting to collapse. Sleeping Beauty. On the other side, Audrey's virtual persona, which hadn't fully turned independent, was like a dark shadow, bringing with it a sense of depravity. She raised her hand and pinched her forehead. Her pupils silently turned vertical, they were pale gold and cold. Botis's mind instantly exploded as bubbles of light appeared on the surface of his body. Within the bubbles, rays of starlight condensed into insects with their heads and tails fused into the void. Psychiatrist, frenzy. This could completely trigger the target's emotions and even cause him to lose control. Botis had already been infected with mental plague, and was in an extremely abnormal state. Following that, he was affected by Sleeping Beauty magic and was in an extremely dispirited mood. Frenzy now triggered everything, immediately making it difficult for him to control himself as he showed signs of losing control. Seizing this opportunity, Katlia opened her eyes, raised her right hand, and rapidly formed a handful of spinning star sand in her palm. The forest beneath the night became even darker. The crimson moon disappeared from the sky as stars appeared one after another. They were densely packed and dazzling. The stars scattered their rays of light, forming a magnificent pillar of light that enveloped the area around Saint of Secrets Botis and his surroundings. In the midst of the shock, Botis became a little more awake. His figure rapidly turned into a blur as he kept blinking, creating more than 10 afterimages in the forest. However, he could not escape the starlight's envelopment, nor could he teleport away. One by one, the starlight melted and dissipated the different Botis. Finally, there was only one person left, genuflecting, propping up his body with one palm as he struggled. Botis's body was in shambles. His eyes were already dark red, and he appeared to be on the brink of insanity. When the starlight was in its final moments, he blinked and dodged the follow-up attack of Audrey's virtual persona. Then, he kept blinking and created doppelgangers beside Katlia and Audrey's virtual persona. One of his doppelgangers grabbed with his left hand, distorting the area where Audrey's virtual persona was located. He concealed it in a bid to restrain the enemy. As for his other doppelganger, he spread open his arms and summoned a thick pillar of light surrounded by holy flames, letting it blast down into the concealed space. During this process, Botis's other doppelganger had secretly removed the concealment of space. Hence, as soon as the shadow corresponding to Audrey's virtual persona was freed from the restriction, it was enveloped by a holy pillar of light, quickly melting away. In his blinking state, Botis could use Beyonder powers at a speed faster than normal, but he couldn't sustain it for long. This was something that was achieved via using his numerous worms of star. Elsewhere, the Saint of Secrets, Botis, was also attacking Katlia. He had used various powers, and in the short span of a second or two, he had inundated his target with a barrage of attacks. This forced Katlia to constantly use the Emperor's New Clothes magic to avoid it. She was momentarily unable to counterattack and was in grave danger. A few seconds later, Botis's blinking finally slowed down. The mania in his heart also eased. At this moment, grayish-white and heavy scales suddenly appeared outside the forest. They were faintly discernible, as if they were forming an extremely oppressive behemoth. In the dark night where the crimson moon was obscured, a nearly invisible stream of breath swept down from top to bottom, enveloping Botis and Katlia. The two demigods felt as though they were struck by lightning as their psyche was torn apart. Their spirit bodies seemed to be penetrated. The breath of a mind dragon. With his mental state already in a terrible state and having used a couple of his trump cards, Botis's mind went blank. As the flashes flashed before his eyes, his body couldn't help but tremble. As for Katlia, she was carrying the moon paper figurine that she had obtained from Fours. This helped her bear the burden of psychic piercing once. Although it was unable to completely eliminate the effects of mind dragon breath, it could help Katlia recover faster. This meant an opportunity in a battle at the demigod level. In just a second or two, Katlia's eyes returned to normal. As for Audrey, who was in her dragon form and hiding in the darkness outside the forest, she cast another mind deprivation on Botis. Without any hesitation, Katlia raised her right hand and condensed the terrifying spear that was stained with fresh blood. She threw it at the Saint of Secrets, Botis. This time, Botis could no longer dodge or resolve the situation. His chest was pierced through by the spear of Longinus. His body stiffened for a moment before it rapidly collapsed, turning into countless dazzling worms of star. Some of these worms of star vanished directly, while others devoured each other. Some of them fused into a distant spot, forming a new Botus. There was no longer any rationality left in his eyes. His body was continuously collapsing, revealing an incomplete and extremely weak mythical creature form. At this moment, an illusory door appeared beside him. It was grayish-blue that had 7 brass locks. The illusory door quickly opened as it spat out a 3-layered, jewelry box, embedded with various gems. The box of the Great Old Ones which had been exiled had returned. With a crazed look in his eyes, Botus caught the box, revealing a cruel and bloodthirsty smile as he tried to open it. The third level. Towards the return of Botus's Grade 0 sealed artifact or the restoration of its normal condition, the Hermit Catlia and Justice Audrey had made a preliminary plan. After all, they weren't confident at killing a demigod in such a short period of time. If not for the fact that Botus had fallen into a trap, having suffered the lethal blows of mental plague, sleeping beauty, and frenzy, and putting him into a crazy and incoherent state, he actually had many opportunities to teleport away without being stopped. In that case, Catlia and Audrey could only wait for Botus to return to a safe house and release Fours. Once the Eye of Mystery prying provided them feedback, they could remotely create an opportunity for Miss Magician to summon the historical void projection. At this moment, facing Botus, who was on the path towards losing control with no way to reverse it and his crazy attempt to fully activate Grade 0 sealed artifact, Catlia and Audrey, one right in the middle of the scene and the other hiding outside the forest, simultaneously took the same action. They took out a translucent dark charm and recited a word in Jotun, star. This was a teleportation charm. Following the patterns, labels, and symbols of the record on the Lemanos travels, Klein had made a charm himself. Since Sephira Castle could mobilize the powers of the Marauder pathway, there was no reason not to respond to the pleas of the apprentice domain. As for the materials needed for the charms, be it mysticologist Catlia or Traveler Fours, the both of them had a certain level of understanding towards it. There was no need for Mr. Fool to teach them. When the two of them teleported away with the triggering of the charm, having plans to come back after a minute or two to confirm the situation, there was a cruel smile on Botus's face. His eyes were filled with madness as his actions suddenly stiffened. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't open the third level of the box of the Great Old Ones. It was extremely heavy, as though it was enveloped and suppressed by layers of forces. There was no way to activate it. This made Botus feel like he was attempting to open a new world, not a box. In an instant, he sensed something, and the madness in his eyes disappeared. Extreme astonishment and fear arose in him. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Wisps of light slid down from Botus's body. When they touched the ground, they transformed into insects formed from resplendent starlight. The insects' bodies were bent into a semicircle, forming a magical glow that resembled illusory doors. At this moment, his incomplete mythical creature form suddenly collapsed and disintegrated in an irresistible manner. The 2 eyeballs of his eyes landed on the ground and were stained with dust. These 2 eyeballs were frozen with an indescribable look of horror. They were maintained perfectly, completely different from the other parts of his body. A Sequence 4 secret sorcerer died just like that. Ha! The box of the Great Old Ones, which had a silver-black surface with many gems embedded in it, dropped beside Botus's eyes, just like a jewelry box commonly seen in aristocratic families. Above the grey fog, in the ancient palace, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he lowered the sea god scepter in his hand in puzzlement. He was just moments from activating the power of Sephira Castle and using the level of an angel to conjure lightning storm. He wanted to prevent Botus from opening the third level of the box of the Great Old Ones, but the Saint of Secrets' mutually destructive counterattack had failed to succeed. He encountered an unexpected failure from the very beginning. After Zio left the first battlefield, she immediately followed the plan and prayed to Mr. Fool. With this, Klein found an opportunity to enter the world above the grey fog. Through the crimson star corresponding to the Hermit and Justice, he monitored the battle. As she moved to the second battlefield, Audrey found an opportunity to pray, so that Klein could use her crimson star to directly interfere with the real world. This was also the reason why Audrey had arrived at her destination later than the Hermit Catlia. According to what Arode said, the third level of the box of the Great Old Ones contains something very terrifying. I thought that the true creator had given it to him in order to create a terrifying disaster at the critical moment, so as to showcase the true colors of an evil god. Who knew that it couldn't be opened? Klein glanced at the crimson star representing the magician and discovered that it was covered in a layer of black ash. It seemed to have coagulated, making it impossible for him to see the scene inside to confirm Miss Magician's condition. This was the first time he had encountered such a situation, evidence of how high a level and odd the box of the Great Old Ones was. As for Sleeping Beauty, magic and the Spear of Longinus that he saw, he came up with some ideas. After learning of the powers of mystical reenactment at the private gathering, Klein overturned his speculations about the fairy tale magic that Bernadette had. He had originally believed that the Emperor had specially created the stories for his daughter based on the fairy tales on Earth, or that after Bernadette's father passed away, she had deliberately reenacted the fairy tales he had told her about as a way to express her grief. From the looks of it, the answer likely wasn't this. Some of the fairy tales before the First Epoch might have been mysterious. This meant that those fairy tales originated from mysterious incidents that had happened in real life. They were spread among the people and gradually became stories. They were recorded down by writers and further embellished. This corresponds to the prophecy regarding the time when the stars are right. Mystery and has never left and has always been around. It was just that in the Earth era, before the First Epoch, they were suppressed by some kind of power or sealed. If that's really the case, some of the legends and stories on Earth can be explained from another angle. It's no wonder there's a Spear of Longinus. I wonder if the Chinese fable of the ethereal utopia, Peach Blossom Spring, is involved in mystery. I'll tell Ma'am Hermit later and see if she can create new magic according to this. I wonder if Bernadette became a mysticologist before the Emperor perished. If she did, it's hard to say if these fairy tale magics were created by the Emperor, a sequence one beyonder of the mystery prior pathway, or by Queen Mystic Bernadette. But no matter what, the Emperor should have discovered that these fairy tales are also mysterious in his later years, and also that he could draw power from them. Well, there's no corresponding diary entry from Bernadette. I can't see the Emperor's reaction and his guesses. One of the reasons he insisted on going to the moon is to verify certain things. It's a pity that most of the myths are fake. There's no way to draw on their power. The novels of the Internet era are the same. Klein sighed slightly as he leaned back into his chair and continued paying attention to the battlefield. In the collapsed forest, the hermit Katlia and Justice Audrey faced the abnormal changes suffered by Botus and tacitly gave up injecting their spirituality to use the charms. Despite maintaining her dragon transformation state, Audrey was still hiding in the darkness outside the forest, wary of any accidents or official demigods who might have sensed the commotion and come to investigate. As for the hermit Katlia, she was pushed to the spot where Botus had died by the wind. She carefully avoided the box of the Great Old Ones. Due to the fact that a scribe could use many powers, a demigod-level sealed artifact would often have extremely negative effects. Apart from the box of the Great Old Ones, Botus only left behind a black pocket which seemed to be part of his robe. Also, there was also the gathered beyond a characteristic, 2 eyeballs, and about 10 worms of star. Most of the worms of star had been destroyed. Considering the horror displayed by the box of the Great Old Ones, as well as the fact that Botus was a high-ranking member of the Aurora Order and could be blessed by a god, Katlia didn't rashly pick up the items. She was afraid that an accident would happen, causing the situation to develop negatively. Previously, during the private gatherings, they had communicated with each other on how to handle such situations. That was, if they had the time and opportunity, they would first sacrifice the item to Mr. Fool and then distribute it above the grey fog. After all, many items might bring about unknown dangers if they were to come into contact with items with unknown negative effects. And there was a high probability that Botus had a Grade 0 sealed artifact. Sometimes, merely knowing the existence of a sealed artifact of this level was enough to cause a sudden death. According to what the Star Leonard had said, it was best not to come into contact with such sealed artifacts. It was best not to ask, describe, or pry into it. Only a true high-level existence could suppress them. Without any hesitation, Katlia took out silver candles and other ritual items from the various hidden pockets of her purple-patterned black robe. She then set up a simple sacrificial ritual. During this process, she pinched her lips, whistled, and created an invisible servant helper. It took about 10 seconds to set up the altar. After quickly reciting Mr. Fool's honorific name and using spiritual materials to open the door of sacrifice and bestowment, Katlia heaved a sigh of relief. She got the invisible servant to move the box of the Great Old Ones, the black pocket, 2 eyeballs, the gathered beyond a characteristic, and the 9 worms of star over to the altar. With a whoosh, the items flew up and passed through the illusory door. When Katlia saw this, she immediately pinched her lower lip with her thumb and index finger, preparing to whistle once again to dispel the invisible servant. But amidst the whistling, the servant remained motionless, as though it had nothing to do with Katlia. The hermit Katlia's eyelids twitched as she clenched her right hand into a fist and pushed it to her mouth, preparing to use the horn of magic. At that moment, a blazing silvery white appeared out of nowhere at the altar. Layers of bolts of lightning formed a destructive storm that enveloped the invisible servant in the middle. All of this quickly calmed down as the mutated servant was completely destroyed. Katlia exhaled and lowered her head, sincerely thanking Mr. Fool. Then, she followed the ritual's ending procedure and packed her belongings. She used the Snow White magic, which was closer to a prophecy technique, to clear the scene of its traces. And at this moment, Audrey had already used the teleportation charm from before and left the scene. Katlia looked around, and considering that Mr. Fool might need something more ritualistic, she took out a card from her pocket and threw it in the middle of the collapsing forest. The card was half inserted into the soil, revealing the image of an old man holding a glass lamp and staff as he explored alone, the hermit of the tarot cards. After a while, the space in the collapsed forest suddenly tore apart, revealing an illusory yet mysterious door. The door opened silently, and a handsome man with black hair and golden eyes walked out. He was dressed in a well-ironed suit, looking mature and elegant. Before he could examine the scene, he heard a loud boom. He could feel a violent storm blowing towards him, and he saw a middle-aged man with an imposing aura appear in front of him. The middle-aged man had rather obvious large earlobes. His hair was dark blue and thick, and there seemed to be countless bolts of lightning hidden in his eyes. He was the Cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms, Archbishop of the Backland Diocese, Deep Blue Officiant Randall Valentinus. The clergyman in the black robe that was embroidered with storm symbols looked around and cast his gaze at the golden-eyed man. He asked in a thunderous voice, "Celt, what happened here?" Celt, the golden-eyed man, shook his head. "I just arrived too." Just as he said that, a mountain-like nearly transparent spirit body appeared in the void and placed a figure in midair. The figure was dressed in a long black, red-patterned bishop robe. His eyes were deep and he didn't have a beard. He was the person in charge of the Backland Diocese of the Church of Evernight, Anthony Stevenson. After the gigantic spirit body completed its mission, it immediately shrunk and entered St. Anthony's mouth. At the same time, black long hair covered his face, and a translucent, drifting spirit appeared behind Anthony. It held onto his shoulder, preventing him from falling. In the next second, a turbulent flow of air rushed over from the Backland city and pushed a figure towards this area at high speeds. Soon, the figure came to a stop. It was an old man dressed in a white priest robe and a clergyman's cap. He had a kind and gentle face. The air that was spewed out from the elder's back vanished as the black tube that was shimmering with metallic light retreated back into his body. This was the Archbishop of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery's Backland Diocese. He was a member of the Divine Council, Hiramik Hayden. He strangely stopped in midair and looked around. Although the battle here isn't too intense, it's definitely at the Saint level. Also, the remnant polluted aura is simply. As they spoke, the 4 demigods looked down at the middle of the collapsed forest. There was a tarot card depicting an old man holding a staff and a glass lamp. The hermit card. Randall Valentinus, Celt, Anthony, and Hiramik instantly fell silent as no one spoke for a moment. Above the grey fog, in the ancient palace, Klein was frowning as he looked at the box of the Great Old Ones in front of him. The moment this Grade 0 sealed artifact was sacrificed, the entire Sephira castle began to stir, as if it had been brought to boiling point. A massive amount of power was automatically activated, forming a torrent that appeared like steam as it completely drowned out the box of the Great Old Ones and wrapped around it tightly. At this moment, the silver-black jewelry box that was embedded with gems seemed to become an insect in amber. There was no room for any movement. Previously, Sephira Castle was triggered when I spied on the true gods or kings of angels and when I was injured. This is the first time it has experienced such changes due to an item from external sources. Klein couldn't help but raise his right hand to wipe away the non-existent sweat. Frankly speaking, he was still a little afraid. He felt that he had been a little carried away after gaining initial control of Sephira Castle. In the past, he didn't dare let a Grade 0 sealed artifact enter this place. And this time, because it didn't involve a uniqueness, and with how he had improved compared to the past, this gave him the thought of making an attempt. Thankfully, it's under control. In the future, I'll have to tell Mom Hermit and the others that they can't pick up anything and sacrifice it to me. I'm not a rag and bone man. After muttering a few words, he began inspecting the box of the Great Old Ones. He remembered that Miss Magician was still inside the sealed artifact, so he planned on figuring out the situation of the box of the Great Old Ones as soon as possible so as to prevent the bait from dying due to wasting time. This sealed artifact's level is very high. Rhodes's understanding of it is rather limited. I'll still have to do it myself. From the looks of it, as long as I don't attempt to divine what the third level is or attempt to seek out the source of the power, the danger is acceptable or even non-existent. Klein made a preliminary assessment based on his spiritual intuition. Immediately following that, he conjured a pen and paper and began doing a divination. After an unknown period of time, he finally opened his eyes and muttered silently. The first level can allow the interior space to switch locations with the target's area and miniaturize the corresponding scene, turning objects into toys. This is an ability that can barely be made use of. The living beings that have been turned into toys must be released within 24 hours. Otherwise, they will be permanently converted. Even their spirit bodies will never enjoy an eternal rest. It's very easy to release them. As long as a specific region is chosen, one so small that it's almost devoid of any living creatures, swapping it with the interior space will do. There is a limit to the scope of this ability. It reaches its limit with a city the size of Backland. Why did I use Backland as an example? The second level records different scenes. There are the abyss, cosmos, and all sorts of places. It allows the wielder and the living beings within a certain range to directly move to the target area. This problem is it's random. A small portion can be designated by the wielder, thus releasing the corresponding location. Most of the time, the chosen location will change, and the destination of the final destination will be unpredictable. As for when the designated location will be effective and when an anomaly happens, there's no way to know. Besides, this seems to be something that can't be affected by good luck. Or perhaps, good luck cannot affect those below sequence 0. This means that I can't use this box of the Great Old Ones as beyond a power to directly transfer the City of Silver out of the forsaken land of the gods. Sigh, if I can, my miracle invoker ritual will be very simple. I'll try and see if making them into toys will work later. The third level is very dangerous, very, very dangerous. I won't take the risk to pry into its secrets. No, this should be called courting death. The negative effects of the box of the Great Old Ones are very simple. It's just that the wielder will randomly vanish, suddenly die, or mutate. If there are no holders, the living beings in the surrounding areas will encounter terrifying matters one after another depending on the distance from it and their sizes. The maximum range is the same as the first level. These Grade 0 sealed artifacts can destroy cities wantonly, killing hundreds of thousands or even millions. It's no wonder they are given the highest ceiling. One is not to ask, describe, or pry into them. Where did the entities that vanished go? This seems to have something to do with the scene of the second level. The reason why the Saint of Secrets dares to move around with this sealed artifact is because he had the blessings of the Angel of Fate Ouroboros. He can reduce the negative effects to a minimum, but even so, he didn't dare to hold on to it for too long because the blessings would wear off. It looks like the reason he didn't manage to recover his lucidity ahead of time and find a chance to teleport away had to do with his luck turning bad. It's really hard to kill saints that are valued by a huge organization. I must say that Mom Hermit is considered experienced and clear-headed. She didn't make any rash contact with it. Instead, she created an invisible servant to hold it. Furthermore, she sacrificed this Grade 0 sealed artifact to me in the shortest time possible. In theory, I can summon a historical void projection to hold this item. After all, it doesn't matter if it dies, vanishes, or mutates. However, the usage time cannot be guaranteed, unless I get Will Orsepton's blessing. The way to seal it is to put it into the spirit world, and that's not enough. It has to be a space that has been distorted and hidden in the spirit world. Then, ordinary water has to be poured into it regularly, allowing the box of the Great Old Ones to play with microbes every day. With so many living beings, it can last for a very long period of time. With this train of thought, there are still many methods to seal it. After roughly figuring out the exact situation of the box of the Great Old Ones, Klein looked at the Grade 0 sealed artifact and felt that the third level no longer seemed as dangerous and impossible to open as before. He vaguely believed that as long as he extended his hand and removed the seal placed onto it by Sephira Castle, he could easily open the third level of the box of the Great Old Ones. What a strong temptation. Klein retracted his gaze and waved his hand, causing the box of the Great Old Ones to fly towards the junk pile in the corner. Regardless of whether it was a Grade 0 sealed artifact or not, head over there to be quarantined and get a hold of yourself. As a terrifying Grade 0 sealed artifact, one has to have a number to show its importance. Unfortunately, I don't know how many Grade 0 sealed artifacts the 7 churches have obtained. It shouldn't exceed 50, right? Yes, the box of the Great Old Ones can be temporarily named 0 to 61. I'll adjust it according to the situation in the future. If Ma'am Hermit isn't able to create a sealed environment, she can place 0 to 61 above the grey fog. Once she needs it, she can apply for it. Of course, she must pray to Will in advance for his blessings. I wonder what stage I'll have to be before the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck can be genuine in name. There's a portion in Miracle Invoker, and there should be a portion in Attendant of Mysteries. Klein amused himself with his thoughts and finally picked up the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Saint of Secrets Botus. It looked like a crystal with countless rays of light refracted within it, forming illusory and resplendent doors. After staring at it for a few seconds, he suddenly threw the Beyonder characteristic into the air. The power of Sephira Castle boiled once again. Under the control of Klein, it formed a corporeal semi-translucent wave and struck the crystal hard. The crystal instantly shattered, splitting into countless tiny dots of light. A pitch-black gas emerged from within before it rapidly melted away, twisting and dispersing inside Sephira Castle. Under the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics, those tiny dots of light slowly gathered together, and in nearly a minute, they reformed into the magnificent and dreamy crystal-like appearance from before, and landed in the palm of Klein's hand. The contamination inside was cleared. Inside Sephira Castle, Klein was equivalent to a Sequence 2 angel. However, he mostly had the power, but not the corresponding levels beyond the powers. He needed the right supporting item to help him. After putting down the secret sorcerer's Beyonder characteristic, he cast his gaze at Botus's remaining 2 eyeballs.